She was forced to marry her own uncle at just 14 years old. Her children were born weak, deformed, and dying one by one. Her only surviving son would grow up so sick, so broken, that people believed he was cursed by witchcraft. But this wasn't a horror story. This was the royal family of Spain, the most powerful empire on earth. And at the center of it all was a queen whose bloodline would collapse an empire and plunge Europe into war. On the night of December 24th, 1634, as church bells rang across Central Europe to celebrate Christmas Eve, a child was born in the quiet town of Wiener Neustadt, just south of Vienna, to the world. It was a moment of joy. To history, it was the beginning of a slow, irreversible tragedy. The child was named Maria Anna of Austria. She entered the world wrapped in silk, prayer, and power, born not into an ordinary family, but into the House of Habsburg, the most dominant royal dynasty Europe had ever known. At the time, the Habsburgs ruled over an empire so vast that it stretched from the heart of Europe to the far edges of the Americas. Kings, emperors, cardinals, and generals all bore the same bloodline. Power was inherited, not earned, and blood, above all else, was protected. Maria Anna's father was Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, a man destined for greatness long before his daughter took her first breath. He was the son of Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, one of the most powerful figures in Europe during the chaos of the 17th century. Ferdinand was not merely an archduke, he was also King of Hungary and Croatia, holding multiple crowns long before ascending the imperial throne. Her mother, Maria Anna of Spain, came from the other half of the Habsburg world. She was the daughter of King Philip III of Spain, linking the Austrian and Spanish branches of the dynasty in yet another carefully calculated union. On paper, the marriage was perfect. Two powerful houses bound together, strengthening Habsburg control over Europe. But beneath the ceremony and titles lay a darker truth. Maria Anna's parents were closely related cousins. This was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was policy. For more than a century, the Habsburgs had followed a single, obsessive rule: marry within the family. Brothers married nieces, uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins. The goal was simple: keep power contained, prevent rival dynasties from gaining influence, and preserve the Habsburg bloodline as something almost sacred. No one asked what the cost might be. The dynasty traced its dominance back to the early 16th century, when two brothers, Charles V and Ferdinand V, divided the vast Habsburg Empire between them. One branch ruled Spain and its global empire. The other ruled Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. Though separated by borders, they remained united by marriage, generation after generation, binding the family tighter with each passing century. By the time Maria Anna was born, this pattern had repeated so many times that the family tree no longer branched outward. It folded inward on itself. Yet, in 1634, none of this was spoken aloud. Maria Anna's birth was celebrated as a blessing. She was baptized with great ceremony, surrounded by clergy and nobles who whispered prayers for her future. In the eyes of the court, she was not a child, but a future asset, a living link between crowns, a bargaining chip for peace treaties, alliances, and wars not yet fought. From the very beginning, her life did not belong to her. Europe at the time was bleeding. The 30 Years' War had been raging since 1618, tearing apart cities, villages, and entire generations. Religion power, and ambition had plunged the continent into chaos. Maria Anna's grandfather, Ferdinand II, stood at the center of that storm, defending Catholic rule with iron resolve. Her father, Ferdinand, would soon inherit not only the throne, but the burden of ending the conflict. In such a world, children like Maria Anna were born with expectations heavier than armor. As an infant, she showed no visible signs of illness. She was described as delicate but healthy. Her early years spent within the guarded walls of Austrian palaces. Tutors, servants, and priests surrounded her. Every word she would one day speak, every step she would take, was already being shaped by the invisible hand of dynastic necessity. No one could yet see the shadow forming behind her. The Habsburgs believed themselves chosen by God, by history, by destiny. They believed blood was the source of legitimacy, and purity the source of power. If weakness existed, it was blamed on enemies, heretics, or divine testing, never on themselves. And so the cycle continued. Maria Anna slept in gilded cradles, unaware that her very existence was the product of a system that valued blood over life, power over consequence. She was born into wealth beyond imagination, yet stripped of the most basic freedom before she could even speak. She did not know it yet, but her body, her marriage, her children, and even the fate of Europe itself would one day bear the cost of that single obsession. Because Maria Anna was not just born into the House of Habsburg, she was born into its slow collapse. To understand the life Maria Anna was born into, one must first understand the mindset of the House of Habsburg, a dynasty that believed power could be preserved only by turning inward. For the Habsburgs, marriage was never about affection, companionship, or happiness. It was a weapon, a contract, a strategy refined over centuries. While other royal families married outward to form alliances, the Habsburgs became convinced that outsiders were a threat. Foreign blood meant foreign influence, and foreign influence meant the erosion of absolute control. So they chose a different path. They married themselves, uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, the same names repeated across generations. Maria, Ferdinand, Philip, Charles, until genealogy itself became a closed loop to the Habsburg court. This was not viewed as grotesque or dangerous. It was seen as divine prudence. The family believed that God had chosen them to rule, and that their blood carried a sacred legitimacy no outsider could ever possess. This belief hardened into doctrine. By the early 17th century, the consequences were already visible, though few dared to speak of them openly. Infants died at alarming rates. Children grew weak, sickly, and malformed. Some never learned to speak properly. Others suffered seizures, chronic illness, or intellectual disabilities. Yet each tragedy was dismissed as coincidence, or worse, as God's will. To question the system was to question the dynasty itself. Maria Anna's parents were living proof of this tradition. Her father and mother were not distant relatives, but first cousins, united not by love, but by necessity. Their marriage strengthened the bond between Austria and Spain, reinforcing the illusion that the Habsburg Empire was unbreakable. In reality, it was already rotting from within. As Maria Anna grew from infancy into early childhood, her life unfolded behind palace walls thick with silence and ritual. She was surrounded by symbols of authority, coats of arms, crucifixes, portraits of ancestors staring down from darkened halls. These faces, stern and familiar, were not just family. They were warnings. Every one of them had sacrificed something for power. Many had sacrificed everything. Her education began early, as it did for all royal children. Tutors instructed her in religion, languages, and court etiquette. She learned how to bow, how to speak carefully, how to listen more than she talked. But there was one lesson she absorbed without ever being taught directly. Her body did not belong to her, from the moment she could walk. Maria Anna was being observed, not as a child, but as a future bride. Courtiers whispered about her health, her appearance, her potential fertility. Every cough, every fever, every sign of weakness was noted and quietly discussed. In the Habsburg world, a royal daughter's greatest value lay in what she could produce. An heir, or better yet, several, across Europe. Royal courts watched Maria Anna's development with interest. She was a living bridge between two empires. One day, she would be sent away, most likely to Spain, to reinforce the bond between the Austrian and Spanish crowns. That decision was never hers to make. It had already been decided the day she was born. Meanwhile, the world beyond the palace was tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War raged on, leaving entire regions devastated. Armies marched, cities burned, famine spread. The Habsburgs fought not only for territory but for religious dominance, determined to preserve Catholic supremacy at any cost. Maria Anna's father, Ferdinand, was being groomed to inherit this chaos, to rule an empire exhausted by bloodshed. In such a world, mercy was weakness, and tradition was law. No one asked whether the dynasty's obsession with blood purity was killing it. No one dared suggest that the weakness of Habsburg children might be the price of generations of incest. Instead, the family doubled down, convinced that abandoning their practices would invite collapse faster than continuing them. Ironically, the opposite was true. As Maria Anna approached adolescence, her future narrowed. There would be no choice of husband, no say in timing, no escape. Her destiny was already tied to a Spanish prince she had never met. Another cousin, another Habsburg, another link in a chain that refused to break. What began as a political strategy had become a genetic trap. Maria Anna did not yet understand the danger she carried within her blood. She could not know that her womb would become the final battleground of a dying dynasty, or that her children would bear the physical consequences of decisions made long before she was born. But history was already moving toward her, and the Habsburg machine, blind, arrogant, and unstoppable, was preparing to consume her, just as it had consumed generations before. Because in the House of Habsburg, power was inherited, and so was the curse. By the time Maria Anna reached her early teenage years, her fate was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a certainty. In the courts of Europe, royal childhood ended early. For daughters of great dynasties, adolescence was not a time of self-discovery. It was a countdown. Every year that passed without a betrothal was considered a risk. Every month delayed threatened alliances, treaties, and the fragile balance of power between kingdoms. Maria Anna was no exception. Behind closed doors, diplomats and courtiers debated her future with cold precision. Maps were spread across tables. Family trees were traced again and again, their branches tangled and circular. The question was never if Maria Anna would be married, but to whom and when. The answer, unsurprisingly, pointed west, Spain. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs was in trouble. King Philip IV had ruled for decades, but his position was weakening. His empire, once the envy of the world, was beginning to crack under the weight of endless wars, economic strain, and internal decay. Spain needed stability. It needed continuity. Above all, it needed an heir. Philip IV had a son, Balthazar Charles, Prince of Asturias. He was young, intelligent, and, most importantly, male to the Habsburgs. He represented hope. The future of Spain rested on his survival and on his ability to produce children who would carry the Habsburg bloodline forward. Maria Anna was the perfect match. She was his first cousin, the daughter of his mother's brother, to any modern observer. Such a union would be unthinkable, but to the Habsburgs, this closeness was not a flaw. It was a feature. It ensured that power would remain sealed within the family, untouched by foreign influence. Negotiations began while Maria Anna was still little more than a child. Letters passed between Vienna and Madrid, filled with formal language and veiled urgency. Terms were discussed, dowries calculated, religious dispensations quietly requested to permit a marriage forbidden by canon law without special approval. Rome, as it always had, complied. God, it seemed, was willing to look the other way. In 1646, when Maria Anna was just 11 years old, the engagement was formally agreed upon. She would marry Balthazar Charles once she came of age. Until then, she would remain in Austria, preparing for her future role as Queen of Spain. To the court, it was a triumph. To Maria Anna, it was simply the world as she had always known it, decisions made around her. Never with her. She was taught Spanish in earnest now. Her tutors intensified her religious instruction. Court etiquette became stricter, more precise. Every gesture, every word, every expression was refined for the role she was expected to play. She was being shaped, polished, and restrained, molded into a vessel worthy of an empire. Yet beneath the surface, fate was already unraveling the plan. In October 1646, just weeks after the engagement was announced, Balthazar Charles fell ill. At first, there was little alarm. Royal children often suffered sickness. Physicians were summoned, prayers were offered, relics were brought to his bedside. But this illness did not pass. Within days, the Spanish court was plunged into panic. The heir to the empire deteriorated rapidly. Fever burned through him. His strength faded. Some whispered it was smallpox. Others blamed divine punishment. Whatever the cause, nothing could stop it. Balthazar Charles died just days before his 17th birthday. The shock was immense. Spain was suddenly without an heir. The carefully planned future collapsed overnight. Years of strategy vanished with a single death. Across Europe, rival powers took notice. A childless king was a dangerous thing. A weakening dynasty invited predators. For Philip IV, the loss was devastating, both personally and politically. He was a widower. He was aging. And now, he had no son to succeed him. The Habsburg machine responded the only way it knew how. It adapted, without mercy. If Balthazar Charles could no longer marry Maria Anna, then the solution was obvious to those in power. The bloodline still needed to be preserved. The Spanish throne still needed heirs, and Maria Anna was still the perfect candidate. There was only one problem. The next available Habsburg groom was Philip IV himself. He was Maria Anna's uncle. The proposal was shocking, even by Habsburg standards, but desperation overrode hesitation. Advisors argued that such unions had happened before. Rome could be persuaded. The political necessity was undeniable. And so, without ceremony, without choice, and without delay, Maria Anna's destiny was rewritten. She would not marry her cousin. She would marry the king, her uncle. At just 14 years old, the girl who had been raised as a diplomatic asset was about to become something far more dangerous and far more tragic, a child bride at the heart of a dying empire. And with that decision, the House of Habsburg crossed a line from which it would never recover. While Maria Anna's personal fate was being sealed behind palace doors, the world around her was already burning. 17th century Europe was not a continent at peace. It was a battlefield stitched together by ambition, religion, and fear. Kingdoms rose and fell not through gradual change, but through fire and blood. And at the center of this chaos stood the House of Habsburg, ruling vast territories while fighting desperately to keep them for more than 20 years. Europe had been consumed by the 30 Years' War, a conflict so brutal that entire regions were left depopulated. What began as a religious dispute between Catholics and Protestants had metastasized into a full-scale struggle for dominance. Armies marched endlessly, cities were looted, fields were abandoned, famine and disease followed wherever soldiers passed. Maria Anna's family did not merely participate in this war. They helped define it. Her grandfather, Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor, ruled with uncompromising Catholic zeal. To him, the war was not only about territory, it was about divine order. Protestants were not political opponents, they were heretics. And heresy, in the Habsburg worldview, had to be crushed. This rigid belief system shaped everything the dynasty did. By the time Maria Anna was born, the empire was exhausted. Its people were weary. Its coffers were strained. But pride prevented retreat. The Habsburgs could not afford to appear weak, not to rival dynasties like the Bourbons of France, and not to their own restless subjects. Into this failing system stepped Archduke Ferdinand, Maria Anna's father, in 1637, just 3 years after his daughter's birth. Ferdinand inherited the imperial throne, becoming Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. He was intelligent, cautious, and far more pragmatic than his father, but he was also trapped by the legacy he had inherited. The war could not simply be abandoned. Too much was at stake. Ferdinand understood something his predecessors had refused to admit. The empire could not win by force alone. Negotiation was inevitable. Throughout Maria Anna's early childhood, peace talks ebbed and flowed. Diplomats traveled between courts. Treaties were drafted, rejected, revised, and discarded. Every concession felt like humiliation. Every delay cost thousands of lives. And yet, slowly, the war began to wind down. By the mid-1640s, it was clear that Europe was heading toward a reckoning. The conflict had reached a stalemate. No side could deliver a decisive blow without destroying itself in the process. The question was no longer who would win, but how much would be left when it ended. For the Habsburgs, peace came at a terrible price. The Peace of Westphalia, finalized in 1648, marked the end of the 30 Years' War. It reshaped Europe's political map and permanently weakened imperial authority. The Holy Roman Emperor would never again wield the power Ferdinand II once held. Regional rulers gained autonomy. Religious tolerance was formally recognized. To the Habsburgs, this was nothing short of defeat, and defeat bred paranoia. As their grip on Europe loosened, the dynasty became more desperate to protect what remained. If land could no longer be held by force, then blood would have to compensate. Marriage alliances, especially internal ones, became even more critical. The family doubled down on its most dangerous habit: consolidation through incest. It was during this fragile moment that Maria Anna's value skyrocketed. She was no longer just another Habsburg daughter. She was leverage, a symbol of continuity in a world slipping out of control. The Austrian and Spanish branches of the family needed each other more than ever. Spain, once overflowing with New World silver, was facing economic decline. Austria, stripped of absolute authority, needed allies to maintain relevance. And so the solution was familiar: bind the family tighter. While soldiers laid down their weapons across Europe, diplomats sharpened their pens. Maria Anna's future marriage was discussed not as a personal matter, but as a strategic counteroffensive against decline. If the Habsburgs could no longer dominate through war, they would dominate through lineage. Inside the palaces, the language of survival was cold and transactional. Children were discussed in terms of fertility. Wombs were evaluated like assets. Women were praised not for intelligence or character, but for obedience and physical resilience. Maria Anna, still barely a teenager, remained unaware of how heavily the future rested on her body. She was raised in an environment where duty outweighed emotion, where sacrifice was glorified, where personal suffering was irrelevant if it served the dynasty. Every lesson she learned reinforced the same truth. Individual lives were expendable. What mattered was the name. What mattered was continuity. What mattered was ensuring that the House of Habsburg, wounded but unbroken, would survive the century. But the dynasty was already fighting the wrong enemy. Its greatest threat was not France, not Protestantism, not rebellion. It was itself. And Maria Anna, standing unknowingly at the crossroads of history, was about to be offered up as proof that the Habsburgs would sacrifice anything, even their own blood, to remain in power. Once the decision was made, it moved forward with ruthless efficiency. There was no public debate, no moral hesitation, no pause to consider the age of the bride or the nature of the union. In the world of the Habsburgs, necessity overruled discomfort. The dynasty had survived for centuries by doing what others would not. This, they told themselves, was no different. Maria Anna would marry King Philip IV of Spain, her uncle, by the late 1640s. Maria Anna was barely 14 years old, physically slight, emotionally unprepared, and utterly powerless. She was informed of her fate not as a proposal, but as a fact. Courtiers framed it as an honor. Priests dressed it in the language of divine duty. Advisors spoke of peace, stability, and legacy. No one asked whether she understood. The preparations began immediately. Spain was the jewel of the Habsburg world, still vast, still wealthy in appearance, still feared. Madrid was its heart, and Maria Anna was to be delivered there as both bride and political remedy. The journey itself was long and exhausting. She traveled across Europe surrounded by attendants, guards, and clergy, moving from familiar Austrian landscapes toward a foreign land whose language and customs she was still learning. Every mile carried her farther from childhood and closer to a role she had never chosen. Behind her, Austria receded. Ahead, Spain waited. Philip IV, meanwhile, prepared to marry again, not for love, but for survival. He was 44 years old, worn down by decades of rule, grief, and disappointment. His first marriage had produced heirs, but death had taken them. His second wife had died young. Now, with his son gone and his empire unstable, he needed children more than companionship. Maria Anna was young, she was fertile, and she was Habsburg. That was enough. On October 7th, 1649, the marriage took place in a church outside Madrid. It was a carefully staged event, solemn, dignified, and deliberately restrained. The age difference was impossible to ignore. The blood relationship was whispered about but never openly discussed. Officially, the union had been sanctioned by Rome, approved by God, and justified by necessity. Maria Anna stood at the altar a queen, but she was still a child. The Spanish court watched her closely from the moment she arrived. Madrid was not Vienna. It was harsher, more rigid, and deeply suspicious of outsiders, even Habsburg ones. Maria Anna was Austrian by birth. Spanish by marriage, and fully trusted by neither. She understood immediately that survival would require adaptation. She learned Spanish with urgency. She memorized court protocol. She learned when to speak and, more importantly, when to remain silent. Every mistake was noted, every success scrutinized. As queen consort, she held status, but not power. Not yet. Philip IV treated her with formal distance. There was respect, but little warmth. Their relationship was not one of intimacy, but of obligation. She was expected to fulfill her duty quickly and efficiently, produce heirs, secure the bloodline, and remain obedient. Behind the walls of the palace, Maria Anna's life narrowed. Her days were filled with prayer, ceremony, and watchful eyes. She was rarely alone. Her body was monitored by physicians. Her health was discussed in whispers. Each missed sign of pregnancy caused concern. Each month without success heightened anxiety. Spain needed a prince. The empire, once unrivaled, was visibly weakening. Wars drained its treasury. Rebellions simmered. France watched eagerly from across the border. The future of Spanish dominance now depended on a teenage girl's ability to give birth, and she knew it. Despite her youth, Maria Anna was not naive. She understood what failure would mean, not just for her, but for the dynasty. Queens who could not produce heirs were cast aside, blamed, or forgotten. She had seen it happen before. She had been raised to avoid that fate at all costs. And so she endured. Years passed. Slowly, inevitably, the pressure yielded results. In 1651, Maria Anna gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Margaret Theresa. The court rejoiced. But the celebration was muted. A daughter was welcome, but insufficient. What Spain needed was a son. More pregnancies followed, more children were born, and then, quietly, they began to die. Infant mortality was common in the 17th century, but among the Habsburgs, it was disturbingly frequent. Weakness, illness, and sudden death followed the royal nursery like a shadow. Each small coffin deepened unspoken fears that no one dared articulate. Maria Anna buried her children while maintaining composure demanded by her position. Grief was private, duty was public. Finally, in 1661, she gave birth to a son, Charles, later known to history as Charles II of Spain. He was alive, for now. The court hailed him as salvation. Bells rang, prayers were offered. Hope, fragile and desperate, returned to Madrid, at last. The dynasty had its heir, but even in his infancy, something was wrong. Charles was weak. He developed slowly. His body did not respond as it should. Physicians reassured the court, but their confidence rang hollow. Maria Anna noticed every delay, every sign of frailty. A mother's instinct told her what no one wanted to admit. The blood had finally begun to fail. Yet there was no turning back. Maria Anna was now Queen of Spain, mother of its future king, and irrevocably bound to a dynasty that demanded everything from her: youth, motherhood, silence, and strength. She had fulfilled her role, but the price was only beginning to reveal itself. By the early 1660s, Maria Anna was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Madrid years earlier. She had learned the rhythms of the Spanish court, the pauses in conversation, the unspoken rivalries, the invisible lines of power that ran beneath every ceremony. Survival had taught her discipline. Motherhood had hardened her. Loss had stripped away illusion. She had buried too many children to remain naive. After the birth of Charles in 1661, hope returned briefly to the palace. The court clung to him with almost desperate intensity. He was watched constantly, surrounded by nurses, physicians, and priests. Every movement was examined. Every illness triggered panic. But as the months passed, the truth became harder to ignore. Charles was fragile in a way that defied reassurance. He struggled to sit upright. He failed to develop at the pace expected of a royal child. His jaw protruded unnaturally, his body appeared weak, and his immune system seemed unable to defend him against even minor ailments. The physicians offered explanations: late development, divine testing, temporary weakness. Maria Anna listened and said nothing. She had learned that speaking too openly was dangerous. To acknowledge fear was to invite blame. If the heir appeared weak, the mother would be scrutinized first, and in a court where loyalty shifted like sand, vulnerability could be fatal. So she endured in silence. Meanwhile, Philip IV was aging rapidly. Decades of war, grief, and political strain had taken their toll. His empire was no longer the unstoppable force it once had been. Portugal had rebelled. France pressed constantly against Spanish borders. The treasury was strained. Corruption flourished. The king knew the truth, even if he would not say it aloud. Spain was declining, and his son was not strong enough to reverse it. By 1665, Philip IV's health failed completely. As he lay dying, the question of succession loomed larger than ever. Charles was not yet 4 years old. He could not speak clearly. He could barely walk unaided. No one seriously believed he could rule, at least not anytime soon. There was only one solution. Maria Anna would rule for him. When Philip IV died in September 1665, Spain entered a new and dangerous chapter. The king was gone, and the throne passed to a child who could not understand the crown placed upon his head. Charles II became King of Spain, and Maria Anna became something far more dangerous than a queen consort. She became regent, in theory. The arrangement was simple. Maria Anna would govern in her son's name until he came of age. In practice, it placed her at the center of one of the most hostile political environments in Europe. Spain was deeply patriarchal. Power was expected to rest in male hands. A foreign-born woman, especially an Austrian, was viewed with suspicion. Many nobles believed she was unfit to rule. Others feared she would prioritize Austrian interests over Spanish ones. They underestimated her. Maria Anna had spent years observing the court from the margins. She had learned who held real power and who merely pretended to. She understood how favors were exchanged, how alliances formed and collapsed, how fear could be more effective than force. She also knew she had no choice. If she failed, her son would be devoured by the very court sworn to protect him. Her regency began under relentless pressure. Spain was exhausted from war. Its economy was faltering. Rebellions simmered in distant territories. France, under Louis XIV, watched closely, waiting for weakness. Every decision Maria Anna made was criticized, every mistake magnified. Male nobles challenged her authority openly, arguing that a woman could not rule an empire, even as they offered no solutions themselves. She responded by surrounding herself with loyal advisors. The most controversial of these was Cardinal Juan Everardo Nithard, a Jesuit and a fellow Austrian. Intelligent, disciplined, and deeply religious. Nithard became her closest confidant. To Maria Anna, he was a stabilizing force. To the Spanish nobility, he was proof of foreign manipulation. Hatred toward him grew quickly. Pamphlets circulated. Rumors spread. Nobles whispered that Spain was being ruled not by its queen regent, but by an Austrian priest. The resentment toward Maria Anna intensified, fueled by xenophobia and misogyny. Yet despite the hostility, she ruled with restraint. She understood something many of her critics did not. Spain could no longer afford endless war. Its people were starving. Its silver fleets no longer delivered the wealth they once had. The empire was bleeding itself dry to maintain the illusion of dominance. Maria Anna chose survival over pride. Under her regency, Spain began withdrawing from conflicts it could no longer win. Treaties were signed, concessions were made, losses were accepted, not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood reality. To many nobles, this looked like weakness. To history, it was pragmatism. All the while, Charles grew older, but not stronger, as the boy king aged. His condition became increasingly impossible to hide. His physical and mental development lagged far behind expectations. He remained dependent, fragile, and easily overwhelmed. Maria Anna watched him with a mixture of maternal devotion and quiet dread. She had done everything asked of her. She had married for the dynasty. She had borne children. She had ruled in her son's name. And still, the bloodline was failing. The truth was becoming undeniable. The House of Habsburg had pushed its own body too far. Generations of internal marriages had finally produced a king who could not carry the weight of empire. Maria Anna now stood at the center of a nightmare not of her own making. She was ruling a declining empire, protecting a vulnerable son, and bearing the blame for centuries of decisions made long before she was born. And the worst was yet to come. Power, once obtained, does not bring peace. It brings exposure. As Maria Anna settled into her role as regent of Spain, the full weight of the crown pressed down upon her with relentless force. Every decree she issued, every advisor she consulted, every silence she maintained was interpreted, dissected, and judged by a court eager to see her fail. She ruled in the name of a child who could barely hold a spoon. Spain, meanwhile, was unraveling. The empire still looked vast on maps, stretching across the Americas, the Philippines, and much of Europe. But its foundations were hollow. The rivers of silver flowing from the New World had slowed. Inflation had ravaged the economy. Soldiers went unpaid. Corruption flourished at every level of government. Worst of all, Spain was fighting wars it could no longer afford. The most draining of these was the Portuguese Restoration War. Portugal, which had been under Spanish rule since 1580, had rebelled in 1640 and spent decades fighting for independence. By the time Maria Anna assumed the regency, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Spain was losing, slowly, expensively, and humiliatingly. France and England supported the Portuguese, eager to weaken Spanish dominance. Every year, the conflict dragged on. Spain bled more men, more money, and more credibility. Maria Anna saw the truth clearly. The war could not be won, yet admitting that truth was politically dangerous. For many Spanish nobles, abandoning Portugal was unthinkable. It represented the loss of prestige, honor, and imperial identity. To surrender territory, even territory already slipping away, felt like betrayal. But Maria Anna had learned a hard lesson from decades of dynastic decline. Pride did not feed armies. Guided by Cardinal Juan Everardo Nithard, she began quietly steering Spain toward peace. Negotiations intensified. Envoys were dispatched. Resistance within the court grew louder. Nobles accused her of weakness, of foreign sympathies, of sacrificing Spanish honor to protect Austrian interests. None of it deterred her. In 1668, Maria Anna made a decision that would define her regency. She signed the Treaty of Lisbon, officially recognizing Portugal's independence. It was a stunning admission of reality and a political earthquake. Spain relinquished a crown it had worn for nearly a century. To Maria Anna's critics, it was proof of failure. To her supporters, it was an act of necessary survival. But the damage to her reputation was severe. Whispers turned into open hostility. Pamphlets circulated accusing her of incompetence. Nobles rallied around alternative power centers, searching for a male figurehead who could replace her. The court grew increasingly polarized, divided between those who wanted reform and those who wanted revenge for lost glory. Maria Anna responded not with force, but with endurance. She understood that time was her greatest weapon. As long as Charles II remained incapable of ruling alone, she remained indispensable, and despite her enemies' hopes, her son showed no sign of sudden improvement. As Charles grew older, his condition became more alarming. He suffered from frequent illness. His speech was limited, his coordination poor. He aged slowly, unevenly, as though his body and mind were moving at different speeds. To the public, he was still presented as the future of Spain. To the court, he was a liability. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed he was cursed. Others whispered of witchcraft, of poison, of divine punishment. Superstition filled the vacuum left by medical ignorance. The more fragile Charles appeared, the more the myth of El Rey Hechizado, the Bewitched King, took hold. Maria Anna heard these rumors, and she feared them, not because she believed in sorcery, but because belief itself was dangerous. A king perceived as unnatural invited unrest. A regent blamed for that condition became a target. Still, she pressed forward. Beyond Portugal, she also sought peace with France, signing the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle to end the War of Devolution. Again, territory was lost. Again, Spain retreated rather than advanced. Again, her critics cried betrayal. But each retreat bought time. Time for Spain to breathe. Time for Charles to grow. Time for the dynasty to survive, if only barely. Yet time was not on her side. As the 1670s approached, pressure mounted for Charles to rule in his own name, by custom. A Spanish king was considered of age at 14. When Charles reached that milestone in 1675, the court demanded an end to the regency. Maria Anna resisted quietly, knowing what they refused to admit. Her son was not ready, not physically, not mentally, not emotionally. Nevertheless, tradition prevailed. Charles II was declared of age, and Maria Anna, after nearly a decade of ruling one of the world's greatest empires, was expected to step aside. She did so outwardly. But power, once tasted, is not easily surrendered, and the empire, fragile and divided, was about to learn that removing Maria Anna from authority did not mean removing her influence, because the struggle for Spain's future had only just begun. In 1675, when Charles II officially reached the age of 14, Spain performed a ceremony of confidence. The regency was declared over. The king would rule in his own name. On paper, it was a return to normalcy. In reality, it was a carefully maintained illusion. Charles stood before the court wearing the symbols of sovereignty, but he did not command them. His body was frail, his movements awkward and uncertain. He struggled to concentrate for long periods. Complex matters overwhelmed him. Decisions confused rather than empowered him. Those closest to him understood the truth immediately. The king was not capable of ruling. The Spanish court, however, was not built to acknowledge weakness. To do so would be to invite chaos, rebellion at home, aggression abroad, and intervention from rival powers eager to exploit Spain's vulnerability. So the illusion was preserved. Charles would be king in name, Others would rule in practice. Almost immediately, factions formed around him. Powerful nobles maneuvered to control access to the king, knowing that influence over Charles meant influence over the empire. Decisions were filtered, shaped, and often made without his understanding, and hovering just beyond the throne. Always present, always watching, was Maria Anna. Though officially retired from the regency, she did not disappear. She could not afford to. Her son was surrounded by men who saw him not as a ruler, but as an obstacle. If she stepped away completely, Charles would be consumed by the court within months. She remained close, advising quietly, guiding subtly, intervening when necessary. This infuriated her enemies. They accused her of clinging to power, of manipulating her son, of refusing to accept her place. Pamphlets once again circulated, painting her as an overbearing mother, an Austrian puppet master poisoning Spain from within. At the center of the backlash stood John Joseph of Austria. He was the illegitimate son of Philip IV, and therefore Charles's half-brother. Unlike Charles, John Joseph was intelligent, charismatic, and physically capable. He had military experience and the loyalty of powerful factions within the court and the army. To many nobles, he was everything the king was not. And to Maria Anna, he was dangerous. John Joseph positioned himself as Spain's savior, a strong male figure who could restore order and dignity. He openly criticized Maria Anna's influence, blaming her for Spain's losses, its retreat from war, and its perceived humiliation. His message resonated. In 1677, John Joseph made his move, backed by armed supporters. He marched on Madrid and forced Maria Anna from power. The court capitulated quickly. There would be no bloodshed, but there would be no resistance either. John Joseph became the de facto ruler of Spain. Maria Anna was removed from the center of authority, pushed aside not through law, but through pressure and intimidation. She was sent away from court, her influence sharply curtailed. For the first time since Philip IV's death, she was truly powerless. The illusion of reform began immediately. John Joseph promised renewal. He promised strength. He promised to restore Spain's prestige through decisive leadership. His supporters celebrated what they saw as the end of foreign interference and feminine weakness. But governing a collapsing empire is harder than seizing it. Within months, the limits of John Joseph's power became clear. The treasury remained empty. The army remained overstretched. Corruption persisted. France remained dominant. No amount of confidence could undo decades of decline. And then, in 1679, John Joseph of Austria died suddenly. His death was abrupt, unexpected, and destabilizing, with no clear successor and no coherent plan for governance. The court fell back into confusion. The very nobles who had supported his rise now scrambled for advantage. And in the vacuum he left behind, one figure returned quietly, decisively, and without ceremony. Maria Anna reclaimed power. There was no formal announcement, no triumphant procession. She simply resumed the role she had never truly abandoned. Advisors returned to her side. Decisions once again flowed through her hands. The court, exhausted and directionless, accepted what it had already learned the hard way. Spain could not function without her. This second regency would be different. Maria Anna was older now, harder, less patient with illusion. She no longer believed in restoring Spain's former glory. That dream had died with her husband. What remained was preservation, of order, of stability, of her son's life. Above all, she was obsessed with one goal: securing an heir. Charles II was now a grown man in name, but not in capability. If he died without children, the Spanish throne would become the most dangerous prize in Europe. Every major power would stake a claim. War would be inevitable. Maria Anna understood this better than anyone, and so she turned her attention to the one solution that had defined her entire life: marriage. If Charles could not rule, perhaps he could still reproduce. Perhaps the dynasty could be saved one last time, not through strength, not through reform, but through blood. It was a gamble born of desperation, and it would fail. But at the time, Maria Anna could not allow herself to see that, because acknowledging the truth that the Habsburg bloodline had reached its biological limit would mean admitting that everything she had sacrificed had been for nothing. So she pressed on. The empire depended on it, and so did history. By the late 1670s, the Spanish court had stopped pretending. Everyone knew the truth they refused to say aloud. Spain's future no longer depended on governance. It depended on reproduction. The empire could survive bad policies. It could endure lost wars. It could even tolerate a weak king. But it could not survive a king without an heir. For Maria Anna, this truth became an obsession. Her son, Charles II, was now officially an adult. Yet he remained trapped in a body that betrayed him at every turn. He was frequently ill. His movements were stiff and awkward. His speech was halting. His moods unpredictable. Physicians rotated endlessly through the palace, offering diagnoses that ranged from divine punishment to humoral imbalance to witchcraft. None of them could fix him. Yet Maria Anna refused to surrender to despair. If Charles could not rule, then perhaps he could still fulfill the one duty that mattered most. If he could father a child, the dynasty might yet survive, at least long enough to delay catastrophe. And so she arranged his marriage. In 1679, Charles was wed to Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the niece of Louis XIV of France. On paper, it was a masterstroke. The union eased tensions with France and temporarily stabilized Spain's position in Europe. The bride was young, healthy, and came from a powerful lineage. Hope returned once more. But within the palace walls, the marriage was a quiet tragedy. Marie-Louise found herself trapped in a foreign court, ruled by rigid etiquette and suffocating suspicion. She was isolated, watched constantly, and blamed almost immediately when no pregnancy followed. Charles, despite his affection for her, was physically incapable of consummating the marriage in any meaningful way. Years passed. No child came. Whispers returned, this time darker than before. Some claimed Marie-Louise was infertile. Others accused her of poisoning Charles, or of conspiring with France to weaken Spain. Superstition and paranoia flourished in the absence of answers. Maria Anna watched it all with growing dread. She knew the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Her son's body was failing completely. In 1689, after a decade of misery, Marie-Louise died suddenly, likely from a ruptured appendix. The court erupted with rumors of poison. Spain's enemies were blamed. The atmosphere turned poisonous with suspicion. Maria Anna wasted no time. Within months, she arranged a second marriage. Charles would marry Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for one reason above all others: her family's extraordinary fertility. Her parents had produced 17 children. If blood alone could save the dynasty, this was the best chance left. But blood could not undo genetics. Once again, the marriage produced no heir. Years dragged on in quiet agony. Charles's health deteriorated further. He suffered seizures, digestive problems, and episodes of mental confusion. He aged prematurely, losing teeth, hair, and strength while still a young man. The court's whispered nickname became permanent: El Rey Hechizado, the Bewitched King. Exorcisms were attempted. Relics were placed in his chambers. Priests performed rituals to break imagined curses. None of it worked. Modern medicine would later reveal the truth the court could not face. Charles was the product of centuries of inbreeding, his genetic inheritance so compromised that survival itself was a struggle. Maria Anna knew she was witnessing the end. Her own health began to fail as well. Years of stress, grief, and political warfare took their toll. By the early 1690s, she was exhausted, physically and emotionally. She had outlived her husband. She had buried children and grandchildren. She had ruled an empire in decline and watched her life's purpose slip through her fingers. In 1692, tragedy struck again when her granddaughter, Maria Antonia of Austria, died at just 23 years old. It was the final blow to any remaining hope of a Habsburg restoration through alternative lines. The future was gone. By the mid-1690s, Maria Anna developed what was almost certainly breast cancer. The disease progressed slowly, painfully, and without mercy. As her strength faded, so did her ability to influence events at court. On May 16, 1696, Maria Anna of Austria died in Madrid at the age of 61. She died knowing she had failed to secure the dynasty, failed to protect her son from his own blood, failed to prevent the catastrophe she had spent her entire life trying to delay. 4 years later, in 1700, Charles II died childless at the age of 38. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty came to an end. What followed was inevitable. Europe descended into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that consumed the continent for 13 years. Millions would die. Borders would be redrawn. Spain would lose much of its empire. The balance of power in Europe would shift permanently. And at the root of it all was a single obsession, a dynasty that believed blood was destiny, a family that married itself into extinction, and a woman who gave everything: her youth, her body, her children, her life, to hold together a collapsing world. Maria Anna was not a monster. She was not a villain. She was the final witness to a system that destroyed itself, and by the time the world learned the lesson, it was far too late. When Maria Anna of Austria was laid to rest in Madrid in 1696, Spain entered a strange and uneasy silence. The woman who had ruled, negotiated, retreated, endured, and absorbed blame for more than 3 decades was gone. For the first time since Philip IV's death, there was no regent, no maternal shield, no quiet strategist holding the court together through sheer force of will. What remained was a king who could barely hold himself upright. Charles II was now in his early 30s, but his body resembled that of an old man. He was frequently bedridden, plagued by seizures, digestive failure, chronic infections, and periods of mental confusion so severe that he struggled to recognize those around him. His jaw jutted forward so dramatically that eating was painful. His speech was slurred, his limbs weak. To Europe, he was no longer a ruler. He was a countdown. Foreign ambassadors in Madrid no longer asked if Charles would die without an heir. They asked when. Reports were sent weekly to Paris, Vienna, London, and The Hague, detailing the king's health in disturbing detail. Each cough, each collapse, each rumored relapse was treated like breaking news, because whoever inherited Spain would inherit more than a crown. They would inherit a global empire. Spain still controlled vast territories across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Its decline had been slow, but its strategic importance remained enormous. Whoever ruled Spain would reshape the balance of power across the entire continent. And Charles II had no children. The court fractured into factions almost immediately after Maria Anna's death, without her authority to restrain them. Rival interests began positioning themselves openly. Conversations that once took place in whispers now happened in full view. The succession crisis was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. Two great powers emerged as the primary contenders. On one side stood the Austrian Habsburgs, Maria Anna's own family. Their candidate was Archduke Charles of Austria, her nephew. He represented continuity, a return to Habsburg rule without uniting Spain and Austria under a single crown, which other European powers feared. On the other side stood France. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had waited patiently for this moment. His grandson, Philip of Anjou, was also a legitimate claimant through Charles II's father. Philip IV, a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, would give France unprecedented influence and potentially dominate Europe. The idea terrified the rest of the continent. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire all watched with growing alarm. A Bourbon-controlled Spain would tilt the balance of power irreversibly in France's favor. War, they knew, would be the only way to stop it. Inside Spain, the court was divided. Some nobles favored Austria, clinging to the old dynasty despite its obvious failure. Others favored France, believing a fresh bloodline offered the only hope of revival. Many simply sought to align themselves with whoever they believed would win. Principle mattered less than survival. And at the center of it all sat Charles II. The man whose bloodline had caused the crisis was now expected to solve it. He was pressured relentlessly to name an heir. Advisors argued, clergy intervened, foreign envoys flattered, threatened, and negotiated. Charles was subjected to spiritual interrogations, exorcisms, and medical experiments, all in the hope of either restoring his health or extracting a clear decision. His mind, fragile and exhausted, was overwhelmed. He had been raised his entire life as a symbol, not a man. Now, in his final years, he was being asked to decide the fate of Europe, something even the strongest rulers would have struggled to bear. The irony was brutal. The dynasty that had married itself for centuries to preserve power now depended on a single, broken man to choose its successor. As Charles's condition worsened, urgency turned into panic. Draft wills were written, destroyed, rewritten. Advisors were dismissed and recalled. Priests argued over divine signs. Rumors of poisoning and foreign plots spread through Madrid like wildfire. Every delay increased the risk of chaos, because if Charles died without a clear heir, Spain would not simply transition to a new ruler, it would explode. And somewhere beneath the layers of ceremony, superstition, and diplomacy lay the uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to confront. The House of Habsburg had already lost. The only question left was who would inherit the ruins. As Charles II drifted deeper into physical and mental decline, the Spanish court became a battlefield without weapons. No armies marched, no cannons fired, but every conversation carried the weight of war. By the late 1690s, it was no longer possible to hide the truth. The king was dying. His body was failing piece by piece. He suffered constant pain, violent seizures, and long stretches of delirium. At times, he believed himself cursed. At others, he believed God was punishing him for sins he could not name. The court exploited this weakness relentlessly. Austrian envoys pressed him to honor his mother's wishes and preserve Habsburg rule. French diplomats countered with promises of protection, stability, and peace. Clergy framed the decision as a divine test. Physicians and confessors surrounded him, each whispering advice aligned with their own loyalties. Charles was no longer a king. He was a prize. Maria Anna of Austria had always believed the safest solution was Archduke Charles of Austria, her nephew. He was Habsburg, but not so closely tied that Spain and Austria would merge into a single superpower. It was a compromise that might have avoided catastrophe. But Maria Anna was gone, and without her steady influence, Charles was vulnerable to manipulation. The French played their hand carefully. Louis XIV understood that overt pressure would provoke resistance. Instead, his envoys emphasized legitimacy. Philip of Anjou, his grandson, was not a foreign usurper, they argued, but a direct descendant of Philip IV, Charles's own father, by blood, by law, by tradition. Philip had a claim. More importantly, the French promised unity. If Philip inherited Spain, the empire would remain intact. France would protect Spanish interests rather than carve them apart. There would be no partition, no humiliation, no slow dismemberment by rival powers. To a dying king terrified of leaving his realm in chaos, the promise was seductive, as Charles's health collapsed. Urgency replaced caution. He was no longer capable of extended deliberation. Draft wills appeared and disappeared. Advisors were dismissed overnight. The court held its breath. Then, at last, a final decision was made. In his final will, Charles II named Philip of Anjou as his sole heir. The document was explicit. Spain and its empire were to pass whole and undivided to a Bourbon prince. No partitions, no compromises, no negotiations. When the will was revealed, Europe erupted. Austria was outraged. England and the Dutch Republic panicked. The Holy Roman Empire condemned the decision. The balance of power that had held Europe together for decades was about to shatter, and there was nothing anyone could do. On November 1, 1700, Charles II of Spain died, just days short of his 39th birthday. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful ruling families in history, ended forever. There were no heirs, no successors, no continuity, only a will and a fuse. Within months, Europe descended into the War of the Spanish Succession. What followed was 13 years of devastation. Battles raged across Spain, Italy, the Low Countries, and Germany. Millions died. Kingdoms bankrupted themselves. Alliances shifted and collapsed. Entire regions were scarred for generations, all because one dynasty refused to let go of its obsession. The war finally ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain, founding a new Bourbon dynasty, but at a terrible cost. Spain lost many of its European territories. Its dominance was broken permanently. The age of Spanish supremacy was over, and the House of Habsburg shut out of Spain forever. Maria Anna had spent her entire life trying to prevent this outcome. She had sacrificed childhood, motherhood, love, and peace in service of a system she did not create and could not escape. In the end, history was unforgiving. Her marriage did not save the dynasty. Her children did not secure the throne. Her regencies did not stop the collapse. They only delayed it. The tragedy of Maria Anna of Austria is not that she failed. It is that she was never given a chance to succeed. She was born into power, trapped by blood, and consumed by a dynasty that mistook purity for strength. And when that dynasty finally collapsed, it took half of Europe with it. This was not the story of a cursed king. It was the story of a family that believed blood alone could rule the world, and learned. Too late. That blood can rot. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1713, Europe looked nothing like it had before the death of Charles II. The War of the Spanish Succession had consumed an entire generation. Cities were scarred, economies shattered, dynasties weakened. What had begun as a question of inheritance ended as one of the most destructive conflicts the continent had ever known. And Spain, once the center of a global empire, emerged diminished, exhausted, and permanently altered. The Treaty of Utrecht confirmed Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, as King of Spain. The Bourbons now sat on the Spanish throne, but their victory came with severe restrictions. Spain was forced to surrender much of its European territory, the Spanish Netherlands, parts of Italy, and key strategic strongholds were lost forever. The empire that once dominated Europe now struggled to defend its own borders. The balance of power had shifted. France had overreached and been contained. Austria gained influence elsewhere but lost Spain for good. England emerged stronger, positioning itself as a global naval power. The modern European state system, based on balance rather than dynastic inheritance, began to take shape. And at the center of this transformation was a dynasty that no longer existed. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone, for centuries. They had ruled by blood alone, convinced that their lineage was divinely ordained. They married within the family to preserve control, believing purity meant strength. What they created instead was fragility, hidden at first, then undeniable. By the time Charles II died, the genetic consequences of this obsession were catastrophic. Modern researchers would later calculate that his inbreeding coefficient was comparable to that of a child born to siblings. His physical deformities, infertility, immune deficiencies, and cognitive impairment were not curses or witchcraft. They were math. They were inheritance, history. However, rarely assigns blame cleanly. For generations, Charles II was remembered as a tragic curiosity, the Bewitched King, a weak ruler whose body failed him. Maria Anna of Austria, meanwhile, was often painted as a manipulative regent, an overbearing mother, or a foreign interloper who weakened Spain. These interpretations miss the deeper truth. Neither Charles nor Maria Anna created the system that destroyed them. They were born into it. Maria Anna did not choose to marry her uncle. She did not design the Habsburg marriage policy. She did not engineer centuries of dynastic isolation. What she did do was survive within it, long enough to rule an empire in decline, protect her son from court predators, and delay a catastrophe she could not prevent. Her life was defined by duty without consent. As a child, she was a bargaining chip. As a wife, she was a vessel. As a mother, she was a shield. As a ruler, she was a scapegoat. Yet without her regencies, Spain might have collapsed even sooner. Without her pragmatism, her willingness to abandon unwinnable wars and accept painful losses, the empire might not have survived long enough to transition at all. She was not weak. She was realistic. The tragedy of the House of Habsburg lies not in cruelty, but in certainty. They believed their system was flawless. They believed tradition was truth. They believed blood carried legitimacy independent of consequence. By the time evidence contradicted them, it was too late. The story of Maria Anna and Charles II is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a warning. Power that refuses to adapt becomes brittle. Tradition that rejects reality becomes destructive. And systems that place ideology above humanity eventually collapse under their own weight. When the Spanish Habsburgs vanished, Europe did not mourn them. It moved on. But the echoes of their choices lingered, for decades in war, for centuries in changed borders, and forever in the quiet realization that even the most powerful dynasties are bound by biology. Blood does not rule history. Consequences do. And the House of Habsburg learned that lesson at the highest possible cost. History has a habit of simplifying people it does not know how to forgive. In the centuries that followed the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs, Maria Anna of Austria was rarely remembered with nuance. Chroniclers reduced her to labels that were easy to digest and easier to blame: the foreign queen, the overbearing mother, the weak regent who surrendered Spain's glory. In popular memory, she became a footnote, an obstacle on the road to inevitable collapse. But collapse is never inevitable in the moment it is lived. To understand Maria Anna honestly, one must strip away the outcome and return to the conditions under which she ruled. She inherited no golden age. There was no moment in her life when Spain was stable, secure, and flourishing under her control. She stepped into power at the precise point when the empire's long decline became impossible to disguise. Her reign, both formal and informal, was defined not by ambition, but by containment. Spain's enemies were stronger. Its economy was weaker, its king was unfit, and its political culture was incapable of reform. Within that reality, Maria Anna's choices appear less like failures and more like triage. She abandoned wars Spain could not win. She accepted territorial losses that others preferred to deny. She sought peace not because she lacked pride, but because she understood arithmetic. Soldiers cost money Spain no longer had. Her greatest mistake, if it can be called one, was believing that blood alone could still save the dynasty. But that belief was not hers alone. It was the foundation of the world that raised her. From the moment she was born, Maria Anna was taught that lineage outweighed individuality, that dynastic survival justified personal sacrifice, and that obedience to tradition was indistinguishable from virtue. To reject those assumptions would have required not courage, but imagination, something no one in her position had ever been allowed to develop. Even her fiercest critics benefited from the system she upheld. The nobles who accused her of weakness had no solutions of their own. They thrived on patronage, corruption, and inertia. They opposed peace while profiting from war. They resented Austrian influence while depending on Austrian protection. Maria Anna became their convenient target because she was visible, foreign, and female, in truth. She was absorbing blows meant for an empire already beyond saving. Her relationship with Charles II has often been caricatured as manipulative or controlling, but the reality was far more fragile. She was not grooming a successor. She was protecting a vulnerable child in a court that would have destroyed him if given the chance. Her closeness to him was not strategy alone. It was necessity. Without her presence, Charles would not have survived childhood. Without her regencies, Spain might not have survived his reign. Yet even Maria Anna could not protect him from the consequences written into his blood. The Habsburg marriage strategy, praised for centuries as genius, had become a biological dead end. Charles's body bore the evidence no theology or ceremony could erase by the time the court acknowledged this reality. Maria Anna was already aging, ill, and isolated. The woman who had held the empire together through exhaustion and compromise found herself increasingly irrelevant in the final years of her life. Her death in 1696 passed with little ceremony beyond protocol. There were no monuments erected in her honor, no public reckoning of her sacrifices, no acknowledgement that she had spent her entire life delaying the inevitable. History prefers dramatic villains or triumphant heroes. Maria Anna was neither. She was a caretaker of ruins, and caretakers are rarely celebrated. Yet when modern historians revisit her regencies without the bias of outcome, a different figure emerges, not a failed ruler, but a transitional one. She governed at the threshold between dynastic absolutism and modern statecraft, between inherited power and political reality. She did not cross that threshold herself, but she stood at its edge longer than anyone else could. The tragedy of Maria Anna is not that she presided over the end of a dynasty. It is that she was asked to save a system that could no longer be saved and judged harshly for not achieving the impossible. In the end, she did not lose Spain. Spain had already been lost. She merely lived long enough to witness it. If Maria Anna of Austria was remembered unfairly, her son Charles II was remembered cruelly. History did not grant him complexity. It gave him a nickname. El Rey Hechizado, the Bewitched King, for centuries. Charles II was portrayed less as a human being and more as a grotesque symbol, an object of fascination, ridicule, and superstition. Paintings emphasized his distorted jaw. Accounts lingered on his weakness, his infertility, his mental confusion. Popular narratives treated him as an inevitability, a punchline to the long joke of Habsburg inbreeding. But myths are comforting. They spare us the responsibility of understanding in Charles's lifetime. The myth of bewitchment served a purpose. It gave meaning to suffering in a world that lacked medical knowledge. It allowed the court to explain away what it could not fix. If Charles was cursed, then no one was truly at fault. Not his parents, not the dynasty, not the system that produced him. Witchcraft was easier than accountability. Exorcisms were performed. Holy relics were pressed against his body. Priests murmured prayers to drive out imagined demons. Physicians prescribed bizarre treatments based on humoral theory, bloodletting, purging, starvation diets that weakened him further. None of it helped. What Charles suffered from was not magic. It was inheritance. Modern genetic analysis paints a grim but clear picture. Charles II likely suffered from multiple hereditary disorders compounded by an extreme level of inbreeding. His immune system was compromised, his hormonal development was abnormal, his skeletal structure was malformed, his neurological function was impaired. These were not random misfortunes. They were predictable outcomes. The House of Habsburg had intermarried so aggressively that Charles's genetic profile resembled that of a child born to siblings. Centuries of repeating the same bloodlines had stripped away resilience. There was no diversity left to absorb defects. Every weakness was amplified, every flaw inherited again and again. Charles was not weak because he was unworthy. He was weak because the system demanded he exist at any cost. And yet, within those limitations, he tried to be a king. Accounts from those close to him describe a man who was gentle, deeply religious, and painfully aware of his own inadequacy. He knew he disappointed people. He knew his body betrayed expectations placed upon him. He knew that Spain whispered behind his back. This awareness haunted him. He prayed obsessively, believing his suffering was punishment. He blamed himself for Spain's decline, internalizing guilt for things far beyond his control. When urged to name an heir, he hesitated not out of indecision, but fear of unleashing war, fear of making the wrong choice, fear of being remembered as the man who destroyed everything. In this, he was not bewitched. He was human. His infertility, so often mocked, was perhaps the most devastating blow. For a king raised to believe that producing an heir was his sacred duty, failure in this regard was not merely political, it was existential. Each failed marriage deepened his sense of uselessness. Each passing year confirmed his worst fear, that he existed only to end something greater than himself. Maria Anna understood this better than anyone. Her closeness to Charles was not domination, it was protection. She shielded him from cruelty when she could, from exploitation when she was allowed, and from despair when she had the strength, after her death. His condition worsened, not just physically, but psychologically. The king became increasingly isolated, surrounded by advisors who saw him as a tool rather than a man. Decisions were made around him, not with him. His signature was sought more than his opinion. By the end of his life, Charles II was exhausted. When he finally named Philip of Anjou as his heir, It was not the act of a manipulated fool, but of a dying man choosing what he believed would cause the least suffering. He hoped, naively, tragically, that unity would prevent bloodshed. He was wrong, but mistakes made under impossible circumstances deserve understanding, not mockery. The myth of the Bewitched King endures because it absolves the past. It allows history to treat Charles as an anomaly rather than a consequence, but when the myth is stripped away, what remains is not a monster or a curiosity. What remains is a warning, a reminder that systems obsessed with purity eventually produce fragility, that power inherited without adaptation decays, and that individuals born into such systems often carry blame for failures they did not create. Charles II did not end the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Habsburgs ended themselves. He was simply the last body standing when the structure finally collapsed. Long after the treaties were signed and the cannons silenced, the legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs lingered, not in crowns or borders, but in questions that refused to disappear. How could a dynasty so powerful destroy itself so completely? The answer was not war. It was not fate. It was not witchcraft. It was choice, repeated, institutionalized, and defended for generations. The House of Habsburg believed that blood was authority, that legitimacy flowed not from consent or competence, but from ancestry. To dilute that ancestry was to weaken the right to rule. And so they turned inward, marrying the same names, the same faces, the same genetic material again and again. What began as strategy hardened into dogma for centuries. The system appeared to work. The Habsburgs rose higher than any dynasty before them. They ruled continents. They shaped religion, politics, and war. Their apparent success reinforced their belief that tradition was proof, but biology does not negotiate. Every generation narrowed the genetic pool. Every marriage between close relatives amplified hidden defects. Each child carried not only the prestige of centuries, but also their accumulated damage. By the time Maria Anna of Austria was born, the warning signs were already present: high infant mortality, chronic illness, physical deformities quietly hidden behind ceremony and silk. The dynasty ignored these signs because acknowledging them would have meant questioning the very foundation of its power. Instead, they doubled down. Maria Anna herself was the product of this system, and later, one of its most visible victims. Her marriage to Philip IV was not a personal tragedy alone. It was a final escalation of a dangerous practice. Uncle and niece, bound not by affection, but by desperation, tasked with producing heirs to save a dynasty already collapsing under its own weight. The children who followed told the story the court refused to hear. They were weak. They died young. They did not thrive. And then came Charles II, the unavoidable evidence. His body became a living archive of dynastic decisions. His jaw, his frailty, his infertility, his illness, all were physical manifestations of abstract ideas turned lethal. The belief that blood alone could sustain authority had reached its biological limit. Yet even then, the system did not stop. Rather than rethink inheritance, the court blamed curses. Rather than reform succession, they pursued exorcisms. Rather than question the structure of power, they sacrificed another generation to it. This is where the story of the Spanish Habsburgs becomes more than historical. It becomes universal, because the impulse that destroyed them, the belief that purity guarantees strength, is not unique to one family or one era. It appears whenever systems prioritize identity over adaptability, lineage over competence, tradition over evidence. The Habsburgs believed they were protecting their legacy. In reality, they were isolating it, by refusing to change. They made collapse inevitable. Maria Anna spent her entire life trying to hold that collapsing structure together. She governed not with grand vision, but with restraint. She retreated when pride demanded advance. She chose survival when glory demanded sacrifice, and for that, she was condemned by contemporaries who mistook stubbornness for strength. History would later repeat their mistake. It remembered outcomes, not conditions. Charles II became a caricature. Maria Anna became a scapegoat. The dynasty became a cautionary tale stripped of empathy. But if there is meaning to be found in their story, it is not in ridicule or moral superiority. It is in recognition. Recognition that power systems, like bodies, require diversity to survive. That inheritance without adaptation leads to decay. That individuals born into rigid structures often suffer most when those structures fail. The House of Habsburg did not fall because it lacked intelligence, faith, or ambition. It fell because it mistook purity for permanence, and when the blood finally gave way, it did so publicly, painfully, and irrevocably, leaving behind not just a changed Europe, but a lesson written into history itself. Empires can survive defeat. They can survive bad rulers. They can even survive loss. What they cannot survive is the refusal to change. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs did not end with a coronation. It lingered. Long after Philip V took the throne and the Bourbon banners replaced the double-headed eagle, Spain continued to feel the aftershocks of a dynasty that had collapsed under its own weight. The damage was not limited to lost territories or diminished prestige. It was structural, psychological, and generational. The country had been shaped for centuries by the assumption that power was inherited, absolute, and unquestionable. When that assumption finally broke, Spain was left without the tools to adapt quickly. Institutions built to serve dynastic certainty struggled in a world now defined by balance, negotiation, and modern statecraft. The transition was painful. Philip V arrived in Spain as a young man raised at the French court, confident, energetic, and determined to reform. But he also inherited a country traumatized by war and deeply suspicious of change. To many Spaniards, the new king was both a hope and a threat, a break from Habsburg stagnation, but also a symbol of foreign influence imposed through violence. The irony was difficult to ignore. For generations, Spain had accepted foreign queens, foreign advisors, and foreign blood in the name of Habsburg continuity. Now, when that continuity finally ended, the same fears resurfaced, this time aimed at the Bourbons. The difference was timing. Europe had changed. The War of the Spanish Succession had made one truth impossible to deny. No single dynasty could dominate the continent without provoking collective resistance. Power would no longer be tolerated as an inherited monopoly. It would be negotiated, constrained, and balanced. This shift marked the quiet beginning of the modern European order, and it came too late for the Habsburgs. In Spain, the consequences of their rule remained visible everywhere. The economy was fragile, infrastructure neglected. Regional identities, long suppressed by imperial centralization, reasserted themselves. Trust in the monarchy had been eroded by decades of secrecy, superstition, and dysfunction at the top. The image of Charles II, frail and childless, had burned itself into the public imagination. He became a symbol not just of a failed dynasty, but of a system that demanded obedience without accountability. His reign taught Spain a brutal lesson. Legitimacy without competence is hollow, and reverence without reform leads to paralysis. Yet history is rarely kind to nuance, as Spain struggled forward under Bourbon rule. It was tempting to place all blame on the past, to treat the Habsburgs as an anomaly, an outdated relic whose failure had little relevance to the present. This narrative was comforting, but incomplete, because many of the structures that enabled Habsburg decline survived them. Centralized authority remained strong. Social mobility remained limited. Decision-making continued to concentrate at the top. Insulated from consequence, reform was discussed more than implemented. Tradition still carried weight long after it had ceased to serve reality. The ghost of dynastic absolutism lingered. In Austria, the Habsburgs endured, but changed. Shut out of Spain, they refocused their power eastward, chastened by loss. The Austrian branch gradually loosened its grip on the most extreme forms of dynastic isolation. Marriages became slightly less insular. Administration slowly modernized. The lesson was not fully learned, but it was partially absorbed. Spain, however, would take longer. The trauma of succession war left deep scars. Fear of foreign domination coexisted with fear of internal collapse. Each new reform was viewed through the lens of betrayal or survival. Progress came unevenly, interrupted by resistance and relapse. In this uneasy landscape, the memory of Maria Anna of Austria and Charles II faded into simplification. They became symbols rather than people. The overbearing mother, the bewitched son, the doomed bloodline. These stories were easier to tell than the truth, that they were individuals navigating a system already broken, doing what they could with the tools they were given. The real legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs was not genetic collapse alone. It was the exposure of a flaw far more dangerous. The belief that systems built for permanence do not need to evolve. Spain would spend the next century proving otherwise, and Europe would never again allow a single family to mistake tradition for destiny without consequence. The shadow of the Habsburg collapse stretched far beyond one throne. It marked the end of an age and the uneasy birth of another. The end of the Spanish Habsburgs marked more than a dynastic failure. It marked a quiet but irreversible shift in how power itself was understood. For centuries, Europe had accepted a simple premise. Rule was inherited, unquestioned, and permanent. Kings governed because they were born to do so. Their bodies were symbols of continuity, their bloodlines proof of legitimacy. If a ruler failed, the assumption was not that the system was flawed, but that God, fate, or enemies were to blame. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs shattered that illusion. Charles II did not fall to rebellion. He was not overthrown by revolution. He did not lose his crown on the battlefield. His body simply could not sustain the weight of history. This was new and deeply unsettling across Europe. Monarchs took notice, not publicly, but privately. Courts began to ask questions that would have once been considered dangerous. What if lineage was not enough? What if blood could weaken rather than strengthen rule? What if dynastic certainty carried hidden costs no army could defeat? These questions did not produce immediate reform, but they planted doubt. In France, Louis XIV had won the immediate prize. His grandson sat on the Spanish throne, but even he recognized the danger of excess. The war had nearly bankrupted his kingdom. The coalition that rose against him proved that no matter how powerful a dynasty became, Europe would unite to stop absolute dominance. Power now required restraint. In England and the Dutch Republic, the lesson was interpreted differently. They saw the Habsburg collapse as confirmation that centralized. Hereditary absolutism was inherently unstable. Their own political systems, already moving toward parliamentary authority and shared governance, appeared not just modern, but safer. balance, not blood, was the future. Spain, caught between these models, struggled to redefine itself. Under the Bourbons, reform was attempted cautiously. Administration became more rational. Military command was reorganized. Taxation was standardized. These were necessary steps, but they came late, and they faced resistance from elites conditioned by centuries of inherited privilege. The shadow of the Habsburgs remained. Many Spaniards still equated stability with tradition. Even when tradition had failed them, others embraced reform out of exhaustion rather than conviction. Progress advanced unevenly, slowed by memory and fear. Yet one thing had changed permanently. No ruler could again claim unquestioned authority based solely on ancestry. The War of the Spanish Succession had taught Europe that dynastic disputes were no longer private family matters. They were continental crises. The death of a childless king could redraw borders, bankrupt states, and kill millions. Succession became a matter of diplomacy, treaties, and international consensus, not just bloodlines. This transformation did not happen overnight, but it began here, in the ruins of a dynasty that had believed itself eternal. Maria Anna of Austria had lived at the turning point of this transformation without ever being able to name it. Her instincts, withdrawal from unwinnable wars, acceptance of limits, prioritization of survival over glory, were early signs of a world moving beyond absolutism. She was not a reformer by ideology. She was a realist by necessity. Had she ruled a century later, her choices might have been praised as statesmanship. In her own time, they were condemned as weakness. History often misunderstands those who recognize endings before others are ready to accept them. Charles II, too, belonged to the wrong moment. His body exposed truths that ideology could not hide. He made visible the cost of rigid systems by existing within them, together. Mother and son became unwilling messengers of change. They did not argue against dynastic absolutism. They did not write treatises or lead revolutions. They simply survived long enough for its contradictions to become undeniable. The House of Habsburg had tried to freeze history through blood. History responded by moving on without them. By the early 18th century, Europe was no longer ruled by families who believed themselves chosen forever. It was ruled by states, fragile, competitive, and increasingly accountable to reality. The age of unquestioned inheritance was ending. And it ended not with a declaration, but with a body that could not produce an heir, and a mother who could not save a system already past its limits. History rarely announces its turning points with clarity. More often, it leaves behind patterns, quiet shifts that only make sense in hindsight. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs was one of those moments. No manifesto declared the end of dynastic absolutism. No single ruler proclaimed a new order. Instead, the lessons spread slowly, absorbed through loss, war, and exhaustion. Europe learned by watching what happened to a family that refused to adapt. The House of Habsburg had believed that permanence could be engineered, that if blood remained pure and power remained enclosed, history could be controlled. Their confidence was not irrational. For centuries, it had been rewarded. They had outlasted rivals, absorbed kingdoms, and ruled continents. Success became evidence, but success also became blindness. By the time the system began to fail, the dynasty had lost the ability to imagine alternatives. Reform felt like betrayal. Adaptation felt like weakness. Acknowledging limits felt like surrender. And so, instead of changing course, the Habsburgs narrowed their path, trusting that what had worked before must work again. Maria Anna of Austria lived inside that narrowing corridor. Every decision she made was constrained by expectations she did not create. She could not abolish dynastic marriage. She could not redesign succession. She could not openly question the legitimacy of blood-based rule without undermining the very authority she was meant to preserve. Her role was not to transform the system. It was to hold it together, and in that role, she did what few others could have done. She delayed collapse. She reduced losses. She chose compromise over catastrophe again and again, even as those choices eroded her standing. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that survival mattered more than pride. But delay is not salvation. By the time Charles II reached adulthood, the consequences of generations of rigidity were written into his body. He was not a warning the dynasty could ignore. He was proof that the experiment had run its course. No ceremony could disguise it. No prayer could undo it. No marriage could reverse it. The system had consumed itself. What followed? The war, the treaties, the redistribution of power, was not simply punishment. It was correction. Europe recalibrated, not out of moral awakening, but necessity. The cost of dynastic certainty had become too high, the risk too great. And so the continent adjusted. Succession laws became more cautious. Diplomatic agreements replaced private inheritance. Balance of power politics emerged as a way to prevent any single family from dragging Europe into war over blood alone. This was not progress born of enlightenment. It was progress born of trauma. The story of Maria Anna and Charles II sits at the center of that trauma, not because they caused it, but because they embodied it. They were the visible outcome of invisible assumptions carried forward for centuries without challenge. They remind us that systems do not collapse because individuals fail. They collapse because structures outlive their usefulness. In later centuries, historians would debate responsibility. Some would blame superstition, others would blame religion, culture, or ignorance. But beneath those explanations lies a simpler truth. The Habsburgs mistook continuity for resilience. They believed repetition guaranteed survival. History proved otherwise. The quiet lesson left behind by their fall is not about monarchy alone. It is about any system that confuses longevity with legitimacy. Any institution that protects itself from change by turning inward eventually weakens its ability to respond to reality. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fall because they lacked power. They fell because they could not imagine power working differently. Maria Anna understood limits. Charles II lived those limits, together. They marked the end of an era, not through revolution, but through exposure and history. Once exposed, does not forget. It moves on. There is a moment in every long historical tragedy when blame begins to lose its usefulness. At first, history searches for villains. Then it looks for heroes. Eventually, it is forced to confront something more uncomfortable: that no individual alone was responsible. By the time the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended, Europe had spent decades assigning guilt. Courtiers blamed queens. Nobles blamed priests. Protestants blamed Catholics. Catholics blamed heresy. Physicians blamed witchcraft. Chroniclers mocked weakness and deformed bodies as moral failures. But over time, these explanations collapsed under their own weight, because none of them explained why the same failures repeated themselves across generations. Maria Anna of Austria was not the first Habsburg woman forced into a dynastic marriage. Charles II was not the first sickly heir. Philip IV was not the first ruler to inherit an empire already in decline. They were not exceptions. They were patterns. And once historians began to see those patterns, the story changed. The tragedy of the Spanish Habsburgs stopped being a morality tale and became something far more unsettling. A case study in systemic failure. A dynasty that had optimized itself for control had sacrificed adaptability. A family that equated legitimacy with lineage had ignored competence, health, and sustainability. In that context, Maria Anna's life looks different. She was not steering the empire toward ruin. She was steering it away from immediate collapse. Her treaties, so often criticized as humiliations, were in fact acknowledgments of reality. Her retreats were not cowardice, but recognition that Spain no longer possessed the resources to dominate by force. She governed as someone managing decline, not expansion. History tends to punish such figures. It prefers conquerors to caretakers, yet without caretakers. Decline becomes catastrophe. Charles II, too, must be understood within this frame. He did not fail to become a strong ruler. The system failed to produce one. His body did not betray Spain. Spain's dynastic obsession betrayed its own future by insisting on producing heirs at any cost. Seen this way, the collapse of the Habsburgs was not sudden. It was gradual, logical, and avoidable, had anyone been willing to question assumptions early enough. But questioning assumptions is dangerous when power depends on them. The Spanish court could not admit that its king was genetically compromised without undermining the sanctity of monarchy itself. It could not reform succession without threatening noble privilege. It could not abandon dynastic marriage without risking alliances built entirely on blood. So it did nothing. It adapted rituals instead of structures. It changed advisors instead of systems. It blamed individuals instead of practices. And by the time evidence became undeniable, the cost of change exceeded the cost of collapse. This is why the Habsburg story matters beyond its era, because it reveals how intelligent, capable people can participate in destructive systems without malicious intent, how tradition can override evidence, how loyalty to identity can silence reason. Maria Anna did not wake each day intending to preserve a failing system. She woke each day knowing she could not dismantle it. Her tragedy was not blindness, but confinement. She could see the edges of decline. She could feel its weight, but she lacked the authority, the allies, and the imagination required to remake the world she inhabited. So she did what history often forces such figures to do. She managed the fall instead of preventing it, and in doing so, she became an easy target for judgment. But judgment, in hindsight, is cheap. Understanding is harder, and it is understanding, not blame, that finally reveals what the Spanish Habsburgs truly were. Not monsters, not fools, but a system that worked too well for too long, and forgot that survival requires change. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that fail quickly. They are the ones that succeed for so long that failure becomes unimaginable. The House of Habsburg did not begin as a cautionary tale. It began as a masterclass in dynastic strategy. Through carefully arranged marriages, calculated alliances, and relentless consolidation of power, the family rose from regional nobility to global dominance. Their empire spanned continents. Their name commanded fear, reverence, and obedience for generations. Their methods worked. That success became their prison. Each victory reinforced the belief that their approach was flawless. Each survival confirmed that tradition was wisdom. Over time, the distinction between what had worked and what must always work disappeared. Strategy hardened into doctrine. Adaptation became heresy. This is the trap of success. By the 17th century, the Habsburgs were no longer asking whether their practices made sense. They were asking only how to preserve them. Dynastic marriage was no longer a tool. It was an identity. To abandon it would mean admitting that centuries of rule had rested on something fragile. That was unthinkable. So, when signs of strain appeared, weak heirs, infant deaths, chronic illness, they were rationalized rather than investigated. Each problem was treated as isolated. Each loss was mourned but never examined. The dynasty lacked not intelligence, but feedback mechanisms. It had insulated itself from criticism so completely that it could no longer learn. Maria Anna of Austria inherited this blindness. She grew up in a world where the family's history was not studied. It was revered. Portraits of ancestors lined palace walls, their expressions stern and triumphant. No one spoke of their failures. No one traced patterns of decline. The past was curated to inspire obedience, not reflection. When Maria Anna later became queen and regent, she governed within that curated reality. She could see immediate problems, empty coffers, exhausted armies, a sickly air. She could not see, or was not permitted to confront, the deeper structural flaw that connected them. To do so would have meant challenging the legitimacy of the dynasty itself, and legitimacy was the one thing she was sworn to protect. Charles II embodied the trap of success more visibly than any ancestor before him. His existence was proof that the system had gone too far, but proof does not persuade those who cannot afford to believe it. The court responded by intensifying rituals, multiplying prayers, and searching for supernatural explanations that preserved the underlying assumption that the system itself was sound. It was not. What made the Habsburg collapse so devastating was not ignorance, but delay. The family had centuries to adjust course, but success had convinced them that adjustment was unnecessary. By the time reality forced itself into view, the cost of reform was higher than the cost of maintaining the illusion. So they chose illusion. This pattern repeats across history. Empires that dominate trade refuse to innovate. Institutions that control knowledge resist transparency. Families that inherit power confuse continuity with merit. The Habsburgs were simply an early, extreme example. Maria Anna's regencies can be read as an attempt, however limited, to break free from that trap. Her willingness to retreat, to negotiate, to accept loss, was an instinctive rejection of absolute certainty. She sensed that survival required flexibility, even if she could not articulate the deeper reason. But flexibility at the surface could not compensate for rigidity at the core. No treaty could fix genetic collapse. No regency could undo centuries of isolation. No heir could be conjured from a system that had exhausted its own capacity to reproduce health. The dynasty had succeeded itself into extinction. This is why history eventually stopped blaming individuals like Maria Anna and Charles II. Because once the full pattern became visible, personal guilt lost relevance. The collapse was baked into the structure long before they were born. They were not architects of failure. They were its final occupants. The tragedy of the Spanish Habsburgs is not that they made the wrong choices. It is that their greatest success convinced them they no longer needed to make choices at all. And when history demands change, certainty is the one luxury it does not forgive. Every failing system shares one final characteristic before it collapses. It loses the ability to listen. By the end of the 17th century, the Spanish Habsburg court was surrounded by noise, rituals, proclamations, sermons, advice, but it was deaf to information that mattered. Signals of decay were everywhere: economic stagnation, military exhaustion, demographic weakness, and a king whose body could no longer sustain the myth of dynastic perfection. Yet the system did not respond. It repeated itself. The Habsburg world had become an echo chamber. Advisors were chosen for loyalty, not insight. Dissent was framed as treason. New ideas were treated as threats rather than warnings. Over time, this created a dangerous illusion of stability. Decisions circulated within a narrow circle, reinforcing assumptions rather than challenging them. Maria Anna experienced this silence firsthand. As regent, she was expected to listen, but only within boundaries. She could hear complaints about taxes, troops, and treaties. She could respond to crises of administration. What she could not hear, what no one could openly voice, was the question that haunted every policy discussion. What if the problem is us? The dynasty had no language for self-critique. This is why superstition flourished, when rational explanations threatened foundational beliefs. Societies turned to the irrational, witchcraft, curses, divine punishment. These narratives preserved the core assumption that the system itself was righteous. If suffering had a supernatural cause, then reform was unnecessary. Charles II became the focal point of this distortion. His body was treated as an anomaly rather than evidence. His weakness was isolated from its origins. Physicians treated symptoms, priests treated souls. No one treated structure. The system responded to data with ritual, not analysis, and ritual cannot correct feedback. Maria Anna understood this limitation instinctively. She did not believe her son was cursed. She did not trust the excesses of exorcism or miracle cures, but she also understood that openly rejecting these beliefs would isolate her politically and spiritually. So she navigated around them, allowing the rituals to continue while quietly managing the consequences. This was not hypocrisy, it was survival. But survival within a deaf system has limits. By the time Charles reached adulthood, the court had lost the capacity to adjust expectations. It demanded performance from a king who could not provide it. It demanded heirs from a body incapable of producing them. It demanded continuity from a lineage that had exhausted itself. When those demands went unmet, the system did what it always did. It searched for someone to blame. Maria Anna was blamed for weakness. Charles was blamed for failure. Advisors were blamed for manipulation. Blame became a substitute for diagnosis. This is the final stage of systemic collapse. When a structure cannot change, it turns inward. It punishes deviation. It protects identity at the expense of function. The goal is no longer success, but preservation of meaning, even if that meaning no longer matches reality. The Spanish Habsburgs reached this stage quietly. There was no single dramatic moment when truth broke through. Instead, reality seeped in slowly, ignored until it became unavoidable. When Charles II died, the dynasty did not fall. It simply ended, already hollowed out. What followed was not chaos born of ignorance, but chaos born of delay. Europe went to war not because the problem was unknown, but because it had been postponed too long. Succession plans that should have been negotiated decades earlier were left unresolved. Structural reforms that might have prevented conflict were avoided to protect tradition. The cost of that silence was measured in millions of lives. This is why the story matters, not because it is exotic or grotesque, not because of deformities or scandal, but because it reveals how intelligent societies can fail, not by lacking information, but by refusing to hear it. Maria Anna lived inside that refusal. She sensed limits, but lacked authority to redefine them. She managed decline, but could not stop it. She absorbed blame that belonged to structures older and more powerful than herself. And Charles II lived as the consequence of that silence, his body the final message a deaf system could not ignore. In the end, history did what the dynasty could not. It listened, and once it did, it moved on, leaving behind a lesson written not in blood alone, but in the quiet truth that systems collapse not when they are attacked, but when they stop learning. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fall because they were cursed. They fell because they could no longer hear themselves failing. When the Spanish Habsburg dynasty disappeared, it left behind more than a vacant throne. It left behind uncertainty. For centuries, Europe had been organized around the assumption that power was predictable. Dynasties rose, ruled, and passed authority along bloodlines that, while occasionally disrupted, were understood, anticipated, and largely accepted. Succession was a family matter, even when it caused tension. The system was imperfect, but familiar. The death of Charles II shattered that familiarity. For the first time in generations, Europe was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The old rules no longer worked. Bloodlines could end abruptly. Dynasties could collapse without warning, and when they did, the consequences were no longer local. They were continental. The Spanish succession crisis proved that monarchy had outgrown its own logic. What made the crisis so destabilizing was not merely the size of the Spanish Empire, but the absence of any legitimate certainty. Every claim to the throne was legally defensible. Every claimant had blood ties. Every option carried catastrophic risk. There was no right answer. This was new, previously. Dynastic disputes had been settled through precedent or force, but Spain's case exposed the fragility of both. Precedent failed because the Habsburg line had collapsed too completely. Force failed because Europe had become too interconnected. Any victory by one power threatened all the others. The result was paralysis followed by violence. The War of the Spanish Succession was not just a struggle over territory. It was a war over meaning, over whether ancestry alone could still justify authority in a world that now demanded stability, balance, and predictability. When the war ended, the lesson was clear, even if few articulated it openly. Absolute certainty was gone. No dynasty could again assume that its bloodline guaranteed continuity. No monarch could rule without considering how their succession would affect the wider system. Power had become conditional, not just on birth, but on acceptance. This marked a psychological shift as much as a political one. Kings continued to rule. Crowns still passed through families. But beneath the ceremony, doubt had entered the structure. Succession was no longer sacred. It was strategic. Dynastic marriages continued. But they were tempered by treaties, partitions, and international agreements designed to prevent catastrophe. The age of blind inheritance was ending, and at the center of this transformation stood the memory of Anna of Austria and Charles II, not as villains, but as symbols of a world that had reached its limit. Anna had ruled as though certainty still existed. Because she had no alternative, her entire political universe depended on the assumption that continuity could be preserved through blood and discipline. Yet her actions, retreating from unwinnable wars, negotiating peace, accepting loss, betrayed an instinctive understanding that certainty was already eroding. She governed as though she were buying time. Charles II lived as though time itself were unstable. His reign embodied uncertainty about health, about succession, about the future of Spain. His inability to produce an heir transformed what should have been a private tragedy into a public crisis of legitimacy. Together, they represented the end of an illusion. The illusion that history could be controlled through lineage. The illusion that tradition guaranteed order. The illusion that power could be inherited without consequence. After the Habsburgs, Europe no longer trusted those assumptions. It did not abandon monarchy, but it constrained it. It did not reject dynasties, but it watched them more closely. It did not eliminate war, but it learned to fear wars caused by inheritance more than wars caused by ideology. This was the beginning of a more fragile, but more honest, political world. A world where power had to explain itself, and that, more than any treaty or battle, was the true legacy of the Spanish Habsburg collapse. After the collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs, Europe did not suddenly become wiser. It became cautious. The War of the Spanish Succession had exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Dynastic inheritance was no longer a private mechanism of power. It was a public risk. One death, one failed marriage, One childless ruler could ignite a continental catastrophe, and everyone had felt the cost. States that survived the war emerged poorer, more suspicious, and deeply aware of their interdependence. The old fantasy that a single family could accumulate crowns without consequence had been shattered by experience. From this point forward, power would be tolerated only when it was balanced. This was not idealism. It was fear. England, which emerged stronger from the conflict, embraced this lesson most clearly. Its leaders saw that preventing dominance was more important than achieving it. The goal was no longer victory, but equilibrium. Diplomacy became a permanent activity rather than a temporary tool. Treaties were written not to end wars, but to prevent the conditions that caused them. The concept of a balance of power moved from theory to necessity. France, despite placing a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, learned restraint the hard way. Louis XIV's ambitions had provoked a coalition powerful enough to nearly destroy him. The message was unmistakable. Success beyond a certain threshold would trigger resistance. No matter how legitimate the claim, Austria, too, absorbed the lesson, shut out of Spain. The Habsburgs refocused their energies eastward and inward. Administrative reform, military modernization, and, quietly, less extreme dynastic isolation began to take shape. The family did not abandon its identity, but it adapted enough to survive. Spain, however, bore the heaviest burden of adjustment. The Bourbon kings inherited not only territory, but trauma. The country had been hollowed out by war and uncertainty. Trust in institutions was weak. Loyalty to the crown was no longer automatic. The monarchy could no longer rely on sacred lineage alone. It had to demonstrate competence. This was a radical shift for a society raised on absolutism. Reforms under the Bourbons reflected this new reality. Governance became more centralized and rational. Ministries replaced personal patronage networks. The military was reorganized, taxes were standardized. These changes were uneven and often resisted, but they marked a clear departure from the dynastic stagnation of the late Habsburg period. Yet even as Europe adapted, it did not forget. The image of Charles II, the childless king whose body failed the state, remained a cautionary symbol, not because he was weak, but because his weakness had revealed the danger of tying an entire system to biology. No institution could afford to hinge its survival on the health of a single individual. Succession planning became strategic rather than ceremonial. Marriage contracts were negotiated with greater attention to political consequences. Treaties included clauses about inheritance. Powers that once ignored distant dynastic arrangements now scrutinized them carefully, understanding that today's marriage could be tomorrow's war. This did not make Europe peaceful. It made it self-aware. The irony is that Maria Anna of Austria had lived her entire political life inside this transition without ever being able to name it. She ruled as though the old system still functioned, but acted as though it did not. Her compromises, retreats, and emphasis on survival over glory anticipated a world where power had limits. She was, in effect, governing in advance of her time. History rarely rewards such figures. They are caught between eras, misunderstood by contemporaries and judged harshly by those who come later. But without them, transitions are often bloodier, more abrupt, and more destructive. Maria Anna's life was one long act of mitigation. She could not stop the collapse. She could not redesign the system. But she slowed the fall, and in doing so, she gave Europe just enough time to adapt. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone, but the lesson they left behind reshaped the continent. Power would continue to exist. Dynasties would endure. Kings would still wear crowns. But certainty, absolute, inherited, unquestioned certainty, had died with Charles II, and Europe would never fully trust blood alone again. When dynasties fall, something always survives them: Sometimes it is a nation, sometimes an institution, sometimes only an idea, reshaped, corrected, and carried forward by those who learned from the wreckage. After the Spanish Habsburgs, what survived was not their bloodline, but a memory, a shared understanding across Europe that inheritance alone was no longer sufficient to hold the world together. This realization did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with fatigue. The War of the Spanish Succession had drained treasuries, emptied villages, and scarred generations. Rulers who survived it were less interested in glory than in avoidance of another dynastic disaster that could consume everything they had left. From this exhaustion emerged restraint. Succession treaties became common. Powers agreed in advance on who could inherit what, and under which conditions. Partition plans, once scandalous, became practical tools to prevent total collapse. The language of legitimacy slowly shifted away from divine right and toward international acceptance. Authority still wore crowns, but it now required recognition. This shift reshaped how monarchies thought about continuity. Blood remained important, but it was no longer sacred in isolation. A ruler's legitimacy increasingly depended on whether their accession preserved stability rather than disrupted it. The Spanish throne itself became proof of this change. Philip V ruled not because his blood was pure, but because Europe, reluctantly, accepted that his rule was the least dangerous option left. His reign was conditional, constrained by treaties, and watched carefully by rival powers. Spain was no longer an uncontested prize. It was a participant in a system that limited ambition through collective pressure. This was the world Maria Anna never lived to see. Had she ruled in this environment, her instincts might have been understood rather than condemned. Her emphasis on survival, compromise, and delay would have aligned with a political culture that valued equilibrium over dominance. Instead, she governed at the end of an age that still believed control could be absolute. She paid the price for arriving too early. Charles II, too, was a figure out of time. His body exposed truths that political language could not yet articulate. He did not challenge dynastic absolutism by argument or rebellion. He challenged it by existing. His inability to fulfill the biological expectations placed upon him forced Europe to confront a reality it had avoided for centuries. That confrontation reshaped history. The lesson that survived the Spanish Habsburgs was not about incest alone, or even monarchy alone. It was about systems that confuse continuity with health. Any structure that prizes sameness over resilience eventually weakens its ability to respond to stress. Blood was simply the medium through which that weakness became visible in later centuries. New systems would repeat similar mistakes: economic, political, ideological, believing that what worked before would always work again. And, like the Habsburgs, they would often ignore warning signs until collapse forced recognition. This is why the story endures. Not because of scandal or spectacle, not because of deformity or superstition, but because it captures a universal moment. The instant when a system realizes, too late, that it cannot survive by repeating itself. The House of Habsburg tried to preserve power by narrowing its world. History preserved the world by moving beyond them. Maria Anna did not live to see that movement completed. Charles II did not understand the role he played in it. Yet together, they marked a boundary between eras, between a Europe ruled by inherited certainty and one governed, however imperfectly, by negotiated reality. Blood failed. What survived was adaptation, and adaptation, unlike blood, can change. Even after dynasties fall, their shadows linger. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone by the early 18th century, but the habits they had cultivated, centralization, ritualized authority, reverence for lineage, did not disappear overnight. Systems rarely collapse cleanly. They fracture, reassemble, and survive in altered forms. Spain carried these ghosts forward. Under the Bourbons, reforms moved the country toward a more modern state. But the memory of absolute dynastic rule still shaped expectations. Power was still imagined as something inherited rather than negotiated. Loyalty was still personal rather than institutional. The crown remained sacred. Even as its foundations quietly shifted, this tension defined Spain's long struggle with modernization. The Habsburg collapse had taught Europe to fear dynastic excess, but it had not erased the emotional comfort of certainty. People do not abandon old beliefs simply because they fail. They abandon them when alternatives feel safer, and safety, after decades of war, was fragile across Europe. Monarchies adapted cautiously. They accepted constraints while clinging to symbols. Constitutions emerged. But crowns remained. Parliaments gained influence. But lineage still mattered. The world was changing, but slowly, unevenly, and with constant resistance. In this context, the story of Maria Anna of Austria took on a new role. She became a warning figure, not officially, but implicitly. Her life illustrated what happened when rulers were trapped between eras, forced to govern new realities with old tools. She was neither revolutionary nor reactionary. She was transitional, and transition is often invisible until long after it has passed. Charles II's memory evolved in a similar way. He was no longer simply the bewitched king to later generations. He became a case study, a reminder that states built entirely around individuals were inherently unstable. His reign demonstrated the danger of investing legitimacy in biology rather than capacity. These realizations did not eliminate monarchy. They transformed it. By the 19th century, the idea that a ruler's personal health could determine a nation's fate seemed increasingly unacceptable. Systems began to distribute authority. Succession laws were clarified. Institutions were built to outlast individuals. The trauma of dynastic collapse echoed through these reforms, shaping decisions even when the Habsburg name was no longer invoked. This is how history works. It rarely announces lessons. It embeds them. The Spanish Habsburgs became embedded memory, a reference point that informed caution, compromise, and skepticism. Their fall haunted policymakers not as a dramatic myth, but as a quiet reminder of what happens when continuity is mistaken for strength. Maria Anna's regencies, once dismissed as weak, began to look prescient. Her instinct to retreat rather than exhaust Spain mirrored later principles of sustainable governance. Her reluctance to chase glory at the cost of survival echoed in the cautious diplomacy of post-war Europe. She had governed as though she sensed what was coming. And in a way, she had. The ghosts of the Habsburgs were not specters of blood or curse. They were ghosts of certainty. Certainty that power could be enclosed. Certainty that tradition was immune to consequence. Certainty that systems did not need to listen to reality. Those certainties died with Charles II. What replaced them was not wisdom, but humility, uneven, reluctant, and often incomplete. Europe learned that even the strongest structures could fail if they refused to adapt. That lesson would be tested again and again in centuries to come. But it was first learned here, in the life of a queen who managed decline, in the body of a king who exposed limits, and in a dynasty that mistook permanence for immortality. The ghosts remain not to haunt, but to remind. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers. As Europe moved further away from the age of dynastic absolutism, memory began to change its function. At first, memory had served nostalgia. Then it served blame. Eventually, it became something more useful. Warning. The Spanish Habsburgs entered this final stage quietly. They were no longer discussed as living political threats or recent failures, but as historical evidence, proof of what happens when power refuses to evolve. Their story became a reference point in debates that would have sounded unthinkable a century earlier. Could authority exist without absolute lineage? Could states survive the loss of sacred monarchy? Could continuity be built on institutions instead of bodies? These questions did not originate in Spain, but Spain answered them first, through collapse. By the late 18th century, European thinkers, diplomats, and reformers increasingly viewed dynastic inheritance with suspicion. The Enlightenment did not destroy monarchy overnight, but it reframed it. Kings were still crowned, but their legitimacy was now expected to serve the state, not consume it. The Habsburg example lingered beneath these conversations. It reminded reformers that tradition, when left unchecked, could become self-destructive. That reverence for ancestry could blind entire systems to evidence. That political order, built solely on inheritance, carried risks too severe to ignore. In Spain, these ideas took longer to settle. The country remained deeply shaped by its imperial past. Pride and loss coexisted uneasily. Reformers faced resistance from elites who still equated authority with tradition. Yet even resistance had changed. It no longer denied the need for adaptation. It argued about its pace. That alone marked progress. Anna of Austria, once dismissed as a weak ruler, was reinterpreted in this shifting climate. Historians began to see her regencies not as failures of will, but as exercises in damage control. She governed an empire already beyond rescue and chose mitigation over spectacle. Her restraint, once mocked, began to look deliberate. Charles II's image also evolved. The grotesque fascination with his body gave way to clinical analysis. Physicians and historians alike recognized that his condition was not an anomaly, but an outcome. His reign ceased to be a curiosity and became a cautionary case. Together, mother and son became symbolic figures in a broader lesson. Systems that refuse to hear feedback eventually receive it through collapse. This lesson echoed far beyond monarchy. Political institutions, economic empires, and even intellectual traditions would later face similar reckonings. Again and again. History would show that longevity does not equal resilience, that repetition without reflection leads to fragility, that success can mask decay until it becomes irreversible. The Spanish Habsburgs were not uniquely foolish. They were uniquely exposed. Their empire was too large, their influence too vast, their failure too visible to be ignored. When they fell, the consequences were so dramatic that Europe could not simply move on unchanged. Memory hardened into warning. And warnings, once internalized, change behavior, even if imperfectly. Europe did not abandon power struggles. It did not abandon ambition. It did not abandon hierarchy. But it began to recognize limits. The belief that any single family could rule indefinitely through blood alone became untenable. Succession was no longer sacred. It was strategic. Authority was no longer unquestioned. It was conditional. Stability mattered more than pedigree. These shifts were subtle, uneven, and incomplete, but they were irreversible, and they all traced back, in part, to a queen who governed decline and a king whose body exposed the cost of denial. The memory of the Spanish Habsburgs did not fade. It transformed from tragedy to lesson to warning. And history, when it chooses to remember in this way, rarely forgets again. There is one failure history almost never forgives. Not cruelty, not ambition, not even catastrophe. History can absorb all of those. What it rarely forgives is refusal, the refusal to adapt when evidence becomes undeniable. The Spanish Habsburgs reached that point long before their dynasty ended. The warning signs were visible for generations: weakening heirs, mounting debts, endless wars, declining influence. Yet the system responded not by changing itself, but by protecting its image. Image became more important than outcome. This is why their fall resonates so deeply. It was not sudden, dramatic, or heroic. It was slow, administrative, and procedural. A dynasty collapsed not in flames, but in paperwork, treaties, and funerals. Maria Anna of Austria spent her life navigating that slow collapse. She did not refuse to see reality. She refused to pretend it did not exist. That distinction matters. Her regencies were acts of acknowledgement in a culture built on denial. She accepted loss where others demanded illusion. She negotiated where others demanded honor. She retreated where others demanded sacrifice. In doing so, she violated an unspoken rule of dynastic power. Never admit limits. History punished her for that honesty. Charles II, by contrast, could not hide limits even if he wanted to. His body made denial impossible. The system responded by surrounding him with explanation rather than reform. Curses instead of causes. Rituals instead of redesign. When the truth cannot be faced, it is mythologized, and myth delays accountability. By the time accountability arrived, it came not as reform, but as war. The War of the Spanish Succession was the price of delay, a conflict not caused by ignorance, but by postponement. Everyone knew the succession problem existed. Everyone understood the risk, but no one was willing to resolve it early, because resolution required abandoning comforting assumptions, so history resolved it instead, violently. This is the final lesson the Spanish Habsburgs leave behind. Systems do not collapse because no one sees the problem. They collapse because seeing the problem threatens identity. The Habsburg identity was built on certainty. Certainty of blood. Certainty of right. Certainty of permanence. To question that certainty was to question the dynasty itself. So questions were deferred, silenced, or spiritualized until deferral was no longer possible. Maria Anna lived at the edge of that silence. Charles II lived as its consequence, and Europe paid the price. When later generations looked back, they did not remember exact policies or treaties. They remembered outcomes. A great empire diminished, a continent at war, a dynasty extinguished, and slowly, almost unconsciously, behavior changed. Rulers became cautious about inheritance. States demanded guarantees. Power learned to justify itself beyond ancestry, not because people became wiser, but because history had demonstrated the cost of refusal. The Spanish Habsburgs were not uniquely immoral or incompetent. They were uniquely inflexible at a moment when flexibility became necessary. Their tragedy was not that they believed in tradition, but that they believed tradition exempted them from reality. History forgives many things. It does not forgive that. Maria Anna's life, when stripped of blame and romance, stands as a quiet counterexample. She did not control the system, but she recognized its limits. Her choices were constrained, imperfect, and often misunderstood, but they were grounded in the acceptance that survival sometimes matters more than victory. She was not rewarded for that acceptance, but history eventually understood it. and understanding, unlike praise, lasts. The last thing history forgives is not failure. It is refusal to change when change is no longer optional. That is the true legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs, and it is why their story still matters. History rarely ends where stories stop. When the Spanish Habsburg dynasty collapsed, Europe did not close the book and move on. Instead, it carried the consequences forward into new systems, new conflicts, and new assumptions about how power should work. The end of the Habsburgs was not a conclusion, it was a transition. By the early 18th century, the world that had produced Maria Anna of Austria no longer existed. The certainty she had been raised to defend, certainty in blood, in divine right, in inherited permanence, had been fractured beyond repair. What replaced it was not stability, but negotiation, not faith, but calculation. Power had become conditional. This shift did not announce itself with philosophy or revolution. It emerged through exhaustion. After decades of dynastic war, European rulers understood something their ancestors had not. Unchecked inheritance was too dangerous to tolerate. The lesson was written in Spanish blood. From that point forward, succession was no longer treated as a private family affair. It became an international concern. Treaties, guarantees, and alliances formed a web of oversight that constrained monarchs long before crowns ever changed hands. In effect, Europe placed dynasties on probation. This was a quiet revolution. Kings still ruled, queens still married for politics. Bloodlines still mattered, but the assumption that ancestry alone justified power had been permanently weakened. Authority now required acceptance by elites, by institutions, and increasingly by states beyond one's borders. Maria Anna never lived to see this world fully formed, but her instincts belonged to it. Her emphasis on containment over conquest, survival over spectacle, reflected a political reality that had not yet become explicit. She governed as though power had limits, even when ideology insisted it did not. That is why she appears contradictory in hindsight to her contemporaries. She seemed timid. To later generations, she appears restrained. To history, she was transitional. Charles II, too, belongs to this in-between space. His life exposed truths the old world could not articulate. His body undermined myths his court depended on. He forced Europe to confront the reality that legitimacy anchored solely in biology was unsustainable. He did not choose this role, but history assigned it to him. What followed, the wars, the treaties, the rebalancing of power, were not punishments. They were corrections, painful, incomplete, and costly corrections, but corrections nonetheless. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fall because they lacked power. They fell because power had changed, and they did not. This is why their story still resonates, because every system that survives long enough risks mistaking familiarity for inevitability. It begins to believe that what has always been will always be. And when reality shifts, as it inevitably does, the system faces a choice: adapt, or collapse slowly while insisting nothing is wrong. The Habsburgs chose insistence. Maria Anna chose endurance. Charles II embodied consequence. Together, they form a complete arc, not of villainy or failure, but of limitation. They mark the moment when an old logic reached the end of its usefulness, and a new one began, unevenly, reluctantly, but irreversibly. The end of the Spanish Habsburgs was not the end of monarchy. It was the end of unchallenged inheritance. And that distinction matters, because history does not abolish power. It reshapes it, and those who cannot reshape themselves are eventually reshaped by force. Maria Anna understood this instinctively, even if she lacked the language to express it. She governed at the edge of a world ending, absorbing its collapse so the next world could emerge with slightly less violence. That is not failure. That is legacy. And in the end, legacy is not what survives unchanged. It is what teaches the future how not to repeat the past. History does not preserve everything. It forgets most names, most decisions, most lives. What remains is not a complete record, but a selective memory, shaped by what later generations need to understand about themselves. The Spanish Habsburgs survived in that memory not because of their victories, but because of their ending. Empires rise and fall constantly. That alone is not remarkable. What made this collapse endure was the clarity of its lesson. The dynasty did not fall to invasion or revolution. It collapsed inward, quietly, predictably, and publicly. Its failure was visible in blood, in bodies, and in consequences no myth could fully disguise. That visibility is why history kept it. Maria Anna of Austria was not remembered because she conquered or transformed Europe. She was remembered because she stood at the threshold of change and absorbed its pressure without breaking the world entirely. Her regencies were not heroic in the traditional sense, but they were stabilizing. She delayed chaos long enough for Europe to recognize what was happening. Delay, in history, is underrated. It buys time for ideas to catch up with reality. Without Maria Anna's years of containment, her treaties, her retreats, her refusal to chase lost glory, the succession crisis would have erupted earlier, with fewer constraints and greater destruction. The war that followed Charles II's death was devastating enough. Without preparation, it might have been worse. History rarely credits such restraint, but it benefits from it. Charles II, too, is remembered not for what he did, but for what he revealed. His reign stripped away comforting illusions. It demonstrated that legitimacy built entirely on ancestry could produce rulers incapable of sustaining the systems they inherited. His body told a story politics could not, and once that story was visible, it could not be unseen. This is why the Spanish Habsburgs became a reference point long after their power vanished. They offered a clear example of a truth every society eventually confronts. Systems optimized for permanence often fail when permanence is no longer possible. Bloodlines, like institutions, require renewal. Isolation breeds fragility. Certainty resists correction. These are not moral judgments. They are structural realities. Later generations would encounter similar dynamics in different forms. Economic empires that monopolized markets until innovation outpaced them. Political systems that centralized authority until accountability disappeared. Ideologies that repeated themselves until reality stopped cooperating, each time. The pattern echoed the Habsburg story, and each time, history reached for the same lesson. The Spanish Habsburgs remind us that collapse is rarely sudden, it is cumulative. It builds quietly while success distracts attention. When it finally arrives, it feels shocking only because warning signs were ignored. Maria Anna did not ignore them. She could not dismantle the system, but she refused to pretend it was whole. That refusal cost her reputation. It cost her authority. It cost her peace. But it spared Spain a faster, more violent reckoning. In the end, history kept her not as a conqueror, but as a witness. Witnesses matter. They connect eras. They carry truth across transitions. They absorb blame so structures can be examined later. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs survives because it speaks to that function. It explains how power fails, not through corruption alone, but through inflexibility, not through ignorance, but through denial. History did not keep their blood. It kept their warning, and warnings endure longer than empires, because every age believes itself immune to the mistakes of the past until it recognizes itself in them. That recognition is what gives old stories new life, and it is why the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs still matters, not as tragedy alone, but as instruction, not about monarchy, but about what happens when any system confuses continuity with survival. When everything is stripped away, titles, borders, dynasties, and names, what remains of history is not power, but meaning. The Spanish Habsburgs lost everything that once defined them. Their empire fractured, their bloodline ended, their certainty dissolved into cautionary memory. Yet paradoxically, their story survived more completely than many dynasties that ruled longer or fell more dramatically, because their ending explained something fundamental. It explained that no system, no matter how sacred it believes itself to be, can escape the limits of reality. That power built on repetition rather than renewal eventually consumes its own foundations. That tradition, when shielded from evidence, becomes indistinguishable from denial. This is why the story endured. Maria Anna of Austria did not survive in memory because she won. Charles II did not survive because he ruled well. The dynasty did not survive because it adapted. They survived because their failure was instructive. Maria Anna stands at the center of that instruction, not as a symbol of weakness, but of endurance within constraint. She lived her entire life inside a system she did not design and could not dismantle. She inherited expectations older than herself and governed under assumptions already cracking. What she offered was not transformation, but containment. She slowed collapse. She reduced damage. She chose reality when ideology demanded illusion. That choice rarely earns admiration in its own time. But history, with distance, understands its value. Charles II represents the other side of the lesson. His body became the final data point a deaf system could not ignore. He did not rebel against tradition. He did not challenge authority. He simply existed as evidence that the old logic no longer functioned. In doing so, he forced Europe to confront the consequences of believing that inheritance alone could carry the weight of the world. Together, mother and son marked the end of an era, not because they wanted to, but because they could no longer prevent it. And that is the final truth history keeps. Systems rarely collapse because of villains. They collapse because they outgrow their own assumptions. The Spanish Habsburgs assumed that continuity was strength, that purity was protection, that repetition ensured survival for centuries. Those assumptions appeared correct until they were not. When the world changed, the system did not, and history moved on without it. What remains is not a tale of incest, superstition, or decadence. Those are details. What remains is a structural warning, one that applies far beyond monarchy or empire. Any institution that seals itself off from correction weakens itself. Any system that confuses identity with function risks collapse. Any power that refuses to listen eventually loses the ability to speak meaningfully at all. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fall because they were cursed. They fell because they could not adapt to a world that no longer needed what they were built to provide. Maria Anna felt that shift without being able to name it. Charles II embodied it without understanding it. History understood it only after they were gone. That is often how endings work. By the time a system realizes it has ended, the future has already begun, quietly, imperfectly, and shaped by lessons learned at great cost. The bloodline vanished. The story remained. And that story, about limits, denial, and the price of refusing to change, outlived every crown the House of Habsburg ever wore. Because history does not preserve what claims to be eternal. It preserves what teaches the future how to survive.